Thank you for joining in today's cryptid horror stories. The first story today is called The Ruten's Toll, and this is a horror story about Krampus. And in this story, in a modern, gated community in the snowy peaks of the Austrian Alps, where wealthy expatriates have built minimalist, luxury villas. The protagonists are a group of high-powered adults who have moved here to escape their scandals back home. They treat the local villagers with disdain, dismissing the local traditions and the warnings about the Night of the Ruten as peasant superstitions used to sell souvenirs. The second story today is called The Dragon's Spit, and this is a horror story about the Cuelebre. And in this story, a disgraced physician whose daughter is dying of a rare, degenerative blood disease that modern medicine cannot cure. He is approached by a syndicate of recovery specialists who claim to have found the lair of a Cuelebre. They don't want the gold, they want the solidified saliva, the legendary healing stones, to sell to the highest bidder. Luke is hired as the medical expert to verify the stone's potency. In the description below, the stories have been timestamped. Also, don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button so you don't miss the stories yet to come. Now for today's cryptid horror stories, I hope you all enjoy. The Ruten's Toll. Marcus Brennan was on his knees, scrubbing. Not the way a man scrubs when he is cleaning, brisk, purposeful, the mechanical motion of a task that will be done and forgotten, but the way a man scrubs when he is trying to erase something, when the stain is not a stain but an accusation, when the act of cleaning is an act of desperate, futile denial. He knelt on the thick, cream-colored wool of the Persian rug in the penthouse's living room, and he scrubbed at a circle of frost that should not have been there. The penthouse was on the top floor of a building called the Edelweiss, one of 7 luxury villas that dotted the mountainside above the village of Hinterthal, in the Austrian Alps. The building was all glass and white concrete and heated marble floors, a minimalist masterpiece that had been featured in 3 architectural magazines, and that Marcus had purchased for €4 million, cash, 2 years ago, when he had left London and his position as the CEO of Brennan Capital Partners and his wife and his reputation, and the increasingly loud questions from the Financial Conduct Authority, and had come to this frozen, beautiful, anonymous corner of the Alps to start over. The penthouse was climate-controlled, humidity held at 40%, temperature at 21 degrees, around the clock, monitored by a system so sophisticated that it could detect the heat signature of a single candle and adjust the airflow to compensate. The windows were triple-glazed, argon-filled, sealed with a compression lock system that was rated for hurricane-force winds. The penthouse was a machine for maintaining comfort, and it was sealed as tightly as a spacecraft, and yet there was a circle of frost on the rug. The circle was perfect, not approximately perfect, not the rough, approximate circle of a spilled glass or a leak from the ceiling, but geometrically, mathematically perfect, with a diameter of perhaps 40 centimeters and edges so sharp and clean that they looked die-cut. The frost was white and crystalline, and it was thick, a layer of perhaps half a centimeter of interlocking ice crystals that sparkled in the morning light that poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, and within the frost, Marcus could see a pattern. Not a random pattern. The crystals were organized, arranged in branching, fractal shapes that looked like the veins of a leaf or the tributaries of a river or the roots of a tree, and the pattern was not decorative. It was functional. It was a structure. It was something that had been grown, not deposited. And it smelled. The frost smelled of goat musk, a thick animal barnyard reek that had no business being in a climate-controlled penthouse in a building that cost more than most people would earn in a lifetime. The smell was not faint. It was thick and immediate and organic, the smell of a living animal, a warm, heavy, sweating, male goat smell that filled the room and clung to the back of Marcus's throat and made his eyes water. And beneath the goat musk, something else. Sulfur. A thin, acrid undertone of sulfur, like a match struck in an enclosed space, and the combination of the two smells, the animal and the mineral, the organic and the chemical, was so alien, so fundamentally wrong in this pristine, white, hermetically sealed space that Marcus's hands had begun to shake before he had even reached for the cloth. He had been scrubbing for 15 minutes. The frost was not coming off. The wool of the rug was not wet. The frost was not melting, not responding to the hot water and the soap and the aggressive, circular motion of his hands. The ice crystals remained intact, pristine, sparkling, as though they were not made of water but of something more durable, something that existed at room temperature, something that was frost not because it was cold but because it was supposed to be frost, because frost was its form, the way a crystal is a crystal not because of temperature, but because of the arrangement of its atoms. Marcus sat back on his heels. His hands were red and raw. The cloth was soaked and useless. The frost circle was undiminished, and the goat musk was stronger now, and the sulfur undertone was sharper, and Marcus became aware of something that he had been ignoring, that he had been scrubbing specifically to ignore. The frost circle was not the only sign. He looked up. He looked at the room, not at the rug, not at the frost, but at the room itself, the whole room, the way a man looks at a room when he realizes that the room has changed, that something has been in it, that something has been here while he slept. The living room of the penthouse was large and open and white. The walls were white. The ceilings were white. The furniture was white leather and pale ash, and the only color was the cream of the Persian rug, and the blue of the sky through the windows and the gold of the morning light that fell across the marble floor in long, clean rectangles. Everything was in its place. The furniture was undisturbed. The art on the walls, a collection of minimalist prints that Marcus had purchased because they were expensive and because they said nothing, was straight and level. The glass coffee table was clean. The white leather sofa was smooth and unwrinkled. But there was something else. Marcus stood and walked through the apartment, and he found them. Not one thing, several things, small things. A faint, crescent-shaped smear of something dark and wet on the marble floor of the hallway, as though a hoof had slipped. A scattering of coarse, black hair on the white leather of the dining chair nearest the door, short, wiry hair, the kind that grows on the legs of a goat, not on the head of a man. And on his pillow on his bed in his bedroom, in the room where he slept, a single, wet birch twig, thin and pale and stripped of bark, lying diagonally across the white linen pillowcase, leaving a thin trail of moisture that had already begun to dry. Marcus picked up the twig. It was cold, not room temperature cold, ice cold as though it had been left outside in the snow and then brought inside, and the cold of it traveled through his fingers and into his hand and up his arm, and his skin prickled with goosebumps, and the twig was wet, and the wetness was not water. It was something thicker, something that left a faint, slippery residue on his fingers, something that smelled, not strongly but unmistakably, of goat musk and sulfur. He put the twig down. He put it on the nightstand, carefully, as though it might break or bite, and he stood in his bedroom in his €4 million penthouse in his gated community in the Austrian Alps, and he looked at the twig, and he looked at the frost circle on the rug in the next room, and he looked at the hoof smear on the marble floor, and he looked at the goat hair on the dining chair, and he did what any rational, educated, sophisticated man of the 21st century would do when confronted with evidence that something impossible had entered his home while he slept. He told himself it was a prank. The village of Hinterthal sat in the valley below the gated community, a cluster of old stone houses, and a church with a copper spire, and a single gasthaus that served schnitzel and glühwein, and that was, according to the brochure that the property management company had given Marcus when he bought the penthouse, a charming example of traditional Alpine architecture. The brochure had not mentioned that the village was also the source of the warnings. Marcus had received the warnings 3 times. The first time was from the real estate agent, a cheerful, red-cheeked woman from Innsbruck who had shown him the penthouse and who had mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that the village had certain traditions related to the winter season, and that the locals were very particular about them. Marcus had nodded and not listened. The second time was from the property manager, a thin, serious Austrian named Kurt who had maintained the building systems and who had told Marcus during the move-in walkthrough that the night of the Ruten was approaching and that it was advisable to respect the local customs. Marcus had signed the paperwork and not listened. The third time was from an old man in the village, a farmer or a woodcutter or someone's grandfather who had stopped Marcus on the street during his first week in Hinterthal and had looked at him with dark, steady eyes and had said in slow, careful English, "You live on the mountain. You are welcome. But the night is coming, and on the night you must be good. Not good like a tourist, good like a child who knows the difference. You understand?" Marcus had smiled politely and said, "Of course," and had not understood and had walked away and had not thought about it again. He thought about it now. He thought about it while standing in his bedroom with a wet birch twig on his nightstand and a circle of frost on his rug and the smell of goat in his climate-controlled penthouse. And for the first time since he had arrived in the Alps, Marcus Brennan felt something that all his money and all his intelligence and all his carefully constructed distance from the world could not protect him from. He felt afraid. The gated community was called Alpenresidenz Hinterthal, and it consisted of 7 villas arranged along a private road that switchbacked up the mountainside above the village. Each villa was a statement of minimalist wealth, glass and concrete and stone, with heated driveways and underground garages and infinity-edge hot tubs that looked out over the valley. The residents were, without exception, wealthy expatriates who had come to the Alps for reasons that were not entirely related to skiing. There was Marcus, of course, who had come to escape the FCA investigation into certain leveraged buyback transactions that had enriched him personally while devastating the pension funds of 3 mid-sized British companies. There was Dmitry Volkov, a Russian industrialist who had come to escape questions about the source of his initial capital, which was widely believed to be the privatization of state assets in the 1990s, a process that had involved, according to various investigative journalists who had a habit of dying, a great deal of violence. There was Claudia Reinhardt, a German pharmaceutical executive who had come to escape a whistleblower complaint, alleging that her company had knowingly shipped contaminated blood products to developing world markets. There was Jean-Luc Martel, a French art dealer who had come to escape allegations of trafficking in Nazi-looted artwork. There was Aisha Okonkwo, a Nigerian oil executive who had come to escape questions about the disappearance of $80 million in exploration funding. There was Pieter de Vries, a Dutch shipping magnate who had come to escape rumors of involvement in a maritime insurance fraud that had resulted in the deliberate sinking of a cargo vessel with its crew still aboard. And there was Rebecca Solomon, an Israeli South African gemologist who had come to escape something she never discussed, something that had to do with conflict diamonds and a vanished business partner, and a silence so complete and so practiced that even Marcus, who was an expert in the art of not discussing things, found it impressive. They were, in other words, not good people. They were not evil exactly, not in the cartoonish, mustache-twirling sense that the word implied. They were ordinary people who had done extraordinary harm and who had the resources to relocate that harm to a beautiful, anonymous corner of the Alps and pretend it had never happened. They were polite to each other. They attended each other's dinner parties. They discussed the quality of the snow and the performance of the market and the latest trends in alpine architecture. And they never, ever asked each other what they had done, because asking would require answering, and answering would require admitting, and admitting would require being someone other than the person they had come here to be. They treated the village of Hinterthal the way wealthy expatriates always treat the local population, with a mixture of condescension and indifference that was occasionally punctuated by performative gestures of generosity, a donation to the church, a sponsorship of the village's winter festival, a photo op with the mayor, that were designed not to help, but to create the impression of helpfulness. The locals, in turn, treated the expatriates the way locals always treat wealthy foreigners who have built glass castles on their ancestral land, with a surface politeness that concealed a deep, slow-burning resentment, and with stories. The stories were the thing. Hinterthal was old, not alpine old, not the charming, restored for tourists old that the real estate brochures like to evoke, but genuinely old, the kind of old where the stones of the houses had been laid by hands that had also laid hands on swords and plows, and the birch rods of a tradition that predated Christianity by 1,000 years. The village had a church, yes, St. Oswald's with its copper spire and its carved wooden doors, but beneath the church, beneath the stones, beneath the snow, was something older, something that the church had been built on top of, not to destroy it but to contain it, the way a man builds a fence not to kill the wolf but to keep it in the woods. The tradition was called the Night of the Ruten. The Ruten, the birch rod, was the instrument of punishment, and the night was the night of judgment, and the one who came on the night was the one who had always come, the one who had been coming since before the church was built, since before the village was a village, since before the Alps were called the Alps, the one who lived in the deep winter and the deep forest and the deep, dark, frozen heart of the alpine wilderness. Krampus. The expatriates knew the name. Everyone knew the name. Krampus was the dark companion of St. Nicholas, the punisher of wicked children, the horned, furred, chain-rattling devil of Central European winter folklore, who had been enjoying a renaissance in recent years as a kind of anti-Santa, a Halloween-meets-Christmas figure celebrated on T-shirts and greeting cards and at costume parties where people wore cheap horns and drank too much. The expatriates knew Krampus the way they knew all cultural phenomena, as a commodity, a motif, a theme for a party. They did not know Krampus the way the villagers of Hinterthal knew Krampus, as a presence, a force, a thing that was not a costume or a card or a charming piece of local color, but a reality as fundamental and as non-negotiable as gravity or the cold or the dark. The villagers had tried to tell them. The old man on the street had tried. Kurt, the property manager, had tried. And the village elder, a woman named Helga Brunner, who was 79 years old and who had the kind of face that looked like it had been carved from the same stone as the mountains, had tried, in a letter that she had hand-delivered to each villa, written in careful, formal English on thick, cream-colored paper, in a hand that trembled but did not falter. The Night of the Ruten is not a festival, the letter read. It is not a celebration. It is not a party. It is the night when the Old One comes down from the mountain and walks among the houses and judges what he finds. In the old days, the judgment was for the children. Those who had been wicked were beaten with the Ruten, and those who had been truly wicked were taken in the sack. But the Old One has changed, as the world has changed. He no longer comes for the naughtiness of children, which is the small, forgivable naughtiness of learning. He comes now for the sins of adults, which are the large, unforgivable sins of knowing. He comes for greed. He comes for cruelty. He comes for the calculated, deliberate, premeditated sins of those who knew what they were doing and did it anyway. Please, I beg you, stay in your homes on the Night of the Ruten. Do not celebrate. Do not mock. Do not burn the birch. The Old One does not forgive, and he does not forget, and he does not accept the excuse that you did not know. Marcus had read the letter, found it charming, and thrown it in the recycling bin. He had shown it to Dmitri and Claudia and Jean-Luc, and they had laughed, and Jean-Luc had said, "We should throw a Krampusnacht party," and Dmitri had said, "We should wear costumes," and Claudia had said, "We should serve black forest cake," and the idea had been born, a modernized Krampusnacht, a sophisticated, ironic, expatriate celebration of a folklore tradition they did not understand and did not respect, held on the very night that the letter had warned them about, in the very building that sat on the very mountainside where the Old One walked. The party was tonight. Marcus stood in his penthouse with the wet birch twig on his nightstand and the frost circle on his rug and the smell of goat in the air, and he told himself it was a prank. He told himself that one of the villagers, the old man from the street, perhaps, or Helga Brunner's grandson, or some local teenager with a sense of humor and a key to the service entrance, had broken in during the night and left these things as a scare, as a protest, as a piece of political theater designed to make the wealthy foreigners think twice about their party. This was the explanation that made sense. This was the explanation that fit within the framework of the rational, the explainable, the world that Marcus had spent his entire life building and maintaining and defending against the intrusion of anything that could not be quantified, calculated, or controlled. He told himself this, and he believed it, and he picked up the wet birch twig from the nightstand and walked to the living room and threw it in the fireplace. The twig lay on the grate, among the ashes of last night's fire, and Marcus stared at it, and the twig did not burn. It sat on the cold ashes, wet and pale and supple, and the water on its surface did not evaporate, and the wood did not dry, and Marcus felt the fear in his chest, that small, cold, animal fear that he had been ignoring since he first knelt on the rug, grow a fraction larger. He lit a fire. He piled kindling and logs around the wet twig and lit the kindling, and the fire caught and the flames rose, and the heat intensified, and the twig, wet, cold, supposedly fresh-cut birch, did not burn. It sat in the flames, perfectly intact, not smoking, not charring, not drying, as though the fire could not touch it, as though it were protected by something that had nothing to do with moisture and everything to do with purpose. Marcus watched the twig not burn in his fireplace for 3 full minutes. Then he closed the glass doors of the fireplace, turned his back, and went to get dressed for the party. The party was at Pieter de Vries's villa, which was the largest of the 7, and which featured a great room with a vaulted ceiling, and a fireplace big enough to roast an ox, and a wall of glass that looked out over the valley to the mountains beyond, where the snow caught the last light of the dying sun and blazed pink and orange and gold. And the whole scene looked like something from a calendar, beautiful, pristine, and completely false, because the beauty of the mountains was real, but the people standing in front of them, drinking vintage champagne and wearing cheap horned masks and laughing too loudly, were not. There were 23 people at the party. The 7 villa owners plus their guests, partners, hangers-on, business associates passing through, and plus the catering staff, 4 young Austrians from the village who moved through the crowd with trays of canapés and bottles, and who kept their eyes down and their mouths shut, and who, Marcus noticed, were all wearing small, iron pendants on thin chains around their necks. The pendants were crude, hand-forged, and shaped like bells. Marcus did not ask about them. He did not want to know. The music was a playlist that Aisha had curated, modern, electronic, with a throbbing bass that Marcus could feel in his sternum, and that reminded him, uncomfortably, of the vibration he had felt in the frost circle on his rug that morning, the faint, persistent, organic tremor that had traveled through his hands and up his arms and into his chest. As though the frost were not a deposit but a pulse, as though the circle were not a mark but a heartbeat, as though something had been in his apartment, something alive, something with a circulatory system that operated on a frequency just below the threshold of human hearing. He shook it off. He drank champagne. The champagne was good, Krug 2008, which cost about €300 a bottle and which tasted like minerals and bread and the distilled essence of someone else's labor. And Marcus drank 2 glasses quickly and felt the warmth spread through his chest and the edges of his fear soften and blur, which was exactly what the champagne was for. The decorations were a joke. That was the point. The modernized Krampusnacht was an exercise in appropriation and irony, Krampus as a fashion statement, Krampus as a theme, Krampus as something that could be consumed and discarded like a cocktail napkin. There were horned masks in cellophane packets, handed out at the door, mass-produced in China, with little tags that said "Official Krampusnacht Party Accessory" in English and German. There were birch switches in vases, like flower arrangements, bundles of dried twigs tied with red ribbon, placed on every surface, and Marcus noted with a dark, unfunny humor that the switches in the vases were dry and brown and dead, nothing like the wet, pale, living twig that had been on his pillow that morning. There were chains, plastic chains, gold-painted, draped over the door frames and the mantelpieces and the backs of chairs, and the guests touched them and swung them and laughed at the clinking sound, and none of them knew what real chains sounded like, what heavy, rusted, iron chains sounded like when they were wrapped around a house and tightening. Marcus moved through the party. He greeted Dmitri, who was wearing a Krampus mask pushed up on his forehead like sunglasses, his heavy, red, Russian face grinning beneath it, a glass of vodka in one hand and a birch switch in the other, which he swatted against his own thigh with a rhythmic, playful thwack. He greeted Claudia, who was elegant and cold and beautiful in the way that certain German women of a certain age are beautiful, by subtraction, by the removal of everything soft and human, until only bone and will and intent remain. He greeted Jean-Luc, who was telling a story about a forged Modigliani to Aisha and Pieter, and the story was funny and the audience was appreciative, and Marcus felt the champagne sour in his stomach as he realized that he was among his own kind, people for whom the destruction of others was not a tragedy but an anecdote. A dinner party story, a thing that had happened and that was now behind them and that could be discussed, over vintage champagne, with the wry, self-deprecating detachment of people who had gotten away with it. The evening progressed, the champagne flowed, the music throbbed. The sun set behind the mountains, and the sky turned from gold to pink to violet to the deep, cold, starless black of an alpine winter night, and the snow on the mountains turned from white to blue to gray to nothing, and the darkness outside the glass wall became absolute. A black mirror that reflected the party back at itself, 23 people in horned masks, swishing plastic chains, swatting birch switches, drinking and laughing, and performing the rituals of a tradition they did not understand in a place that did not belong to them on a night that was not theirs. At 9 o'clock the old woman came. Marcus was near the front door when he heard the knock, not a polite knock but a firm, deliberate, three-stroke knock, the kind that a person delivers when they are not asking to be let in, but announcing that they are coming in. He opened the door, and Helga Brunner was standing on the step, and she was not alone. Behind her in the driveway were 6 people, villagers. Marcus recognized them, the old man from the street, Kurt the property manager, and 4 others, men and women, all older, all dressed in heavy wool coats and work boots, all wearing the small iron bell pendants on their necks. They stood in the snow in a line, and they did not speak, and their faces were the faces of people who had come to deliver a message and who expected it to be ignored and who had come anyway, because that was their duty, because that was what the tradition required. The warning must be given, and if it was not heeded, the consequences were not theirs to bear. Helga stepped inside. She was small, not petite, not small in the diminutive, charming way that the word is sometimes used, but small in the way that old mountain people are small, compressed by decades of wind and cold and altitude into something dense and hard and unbreakable. She wore a black wool coat and a black wool scarf in the iron bell pendant, and her face was the face that Marcus had imagined when he read her letter, carved from stone, weathered by time, with deep lines around the mouth and eyes that were dark and still, and that looked at him, the way the mountains looked at the valley, from above with patience, with the infinite, indifferent patience of something that had been here for a long time and would be here for a long time after. "You are having the party," she said, not a question. "Yes," Marcus said, "we are." "I wrote to you." "You did, it was very." "Don't." Her voice was quiet, but it stopped him the way a wall stops a runner, not with violence but with finality. "Do not tell me it was very thoughtful or very interesting or very well written. I did not write to you for your opinion. I wrote to you to save your life." A silence fell. The music throbbed. The The guests in the great room had noticed the old woman at the door and were watching with the idle, slightly amused curiosity of people who are enjoying a spectacle that does not concern them. Dmitri lowered his Krampus mask over his face and peered through the eye holes. Claudia raised an eyebrow. Jean-Luc leaned against the mantelpiece and swirled his wine. Helga stepped further inside. She looked at the decorations, the masks, the plastic chains, the birch switches in their vases, and her face did not change, but something in her eyes did, something that was not anger but grief, the grief of a person watching something sacred being profaned and knowing that the profanation would be punished, and that the punishment would be terrible, and that nothing she could say or do would prevent it. "The night of the Ruten is tonight," she said, and she spoke loudly enough for the room to hear, and the music seemed to dim as though the house itself were listening. "You have been warned. You have been told what the Old One is and what he does. You have chosen to ignore the warning. I'm here to give you one last chance. Cancel this party. Go to your homes, lock your doors, do not wear the masks, do not carry the switches, do not burn the birch, and do not mock him." She paused. The room was silent. Even Dmitri had stopped grinning. "He does not come for children anymore," Helga said. "He comes for you, for your greed, for your cruelty, for the calculated, deliberate sins you have committed against people who could not defend themselves. He knows what you have done. He has always known. The mountain keeps no secrets, and the Old One is the mountain's judge. If you celebrate tonight, if you mock him tonight, if you burn the birch tonight, you will invite him in, and he will accept the invitation, and he will come, and he will not leave until the judgment is complete." The silence held. The guests exchanged glances, uncomfortable, slightly embarrassed, the glances of people who have been told something they do not believe by someone they do not respect. Marcus saw the looks and felt the champagne warmth in his chest and the fading fear of the morning, and he made a choice. He made the choice that he would later understand was the last choice he ever made freely. "Thank you, Helga," he said, and his voice was polite and warm and utterly without sincerity. "That was very, very dramatic, really, but I think you've misunderstood the occasion. We're not mocking anyone. We're celebrating. We're celebrating the local tradition, in fact. Isn't that what you want? For the expatriates to embrace the local culture?" Helga looked at him. Her dark, still eyes looked at him, the way Goro's eyes would later look at Daniel Cho on a different mountain, in a different country, on a different night, when a different creature from a different tradition came down from the sky. She looked at him the way old people who have lived their entire lives in the company of something terrible look at people who have not. And what she felt was not anger or contempt, but a kind of exhausted, patient sorrow. The sorrow of someone who has delivered a message that will not be heeded, and who knows that the messenger is always the first to be blamed. "You have been told," she said. "God help you." She turned and walked out the door, and the 6 villagers turned and followed her, and they walked down the driveway and into the snow and disappeared into the dark, and Marcus closed the door and turned back to the party and said, "Well, that was fun. Who needs a refill?" The laughter was too loud and too long, and it was the laughter of people who are not amused but afraid. And the fear is small, still manageable, still something that can be drowned in champagne and music and the warm, comforting presence of other equally guilty people, and the party continued. It was Jean-Luc who burned the birch. Of course it was Jean-Luc, the art dealer, the aesthete, the man who trafficked in stolen paintings and forged provenance, and who treated every object, no matter how sacred or how profane, as a commodity to be acquired and consumed and discarded. He was standing by the fireplace, 2 glasses of wine past sobriety, and he picked up one of the birch switches from the vase on the mantelpiece and held it up and said, in his clipped Parisian English, "You know what this is? This is a Ruten, a birch rod, the instrument of punishment. In the old days they used these to beat the wicked children on Krampusnacht. Can you imagine, beating children with a stick because they were naughty? Barbaric, really." He held the switch over the fire. The flames licked at the dry twigs, and the birch caught quickly, crackling and popping, and the smoke rose, and the guests watched, some laughing, some silent, and Marcus saw the switch burn and remembered the twig on his pillow, the twig that had not burned in his own fireplace, and the fear in his chest, which had been small and manageable, flickered. "Here's to the old one," Jean-Luc said, raising his glass and the burning switch together, and the guests raised their glasses, and some of them laughed, and the birch burned, and the smoke rose, and the fire crackled, and in the smoke Marcus thought he saw something. A shape, a distortion, a ripple in the air above the flames that was not heat and was not smoke but was something else, something that moved and twisted and then was gone, and the switch was ash, and Jean-Luc was laughing, and the party continued. The chains began at 10:15. Marcus was in the kitchen, refreshing his glass when he heard it. Not at first, not consciously. It came the way a sound comes when you are in a noisy room, and a new sound enters not through the air but through the floor, not through your ears but through your feet, and your body knows about it before your brain does. A clink, small, metallic, rhythmic. Not the clink of glasses or the clink of jewelry or the clink of the plastic chains on the door frames, but a heavier, duller, older clink, the clink of iron, of rusted iron, of iron that has been in the cold and the damp for a long time and that is being dragged across a surface. Clink, clink, clink. Marcus put his glass down. He stood in the kitchen and listened, and the sound was not coming from the kitchen and was not coming from the great room and was not coming from outside. It was coming from the walls. Clink, clink, clink. The rhythm was steady, slow, the pace of a walk, not a run, the pace of something that is moving with confidence, with patience, with the knowledge that it has all the time in the world and that its prey does not. The sound was inside the walls, as though someone, or something, were dragging chains through the interior of the house, through the space between the drywall and the insulation, through the hollow, hidden, structural guts of the building. Clink, clink, clink. Marcus walked to the kitchen door and looked into the great room. The music was still playing. The guests were still talking, still laughing, still drinking. But something had changed. Marcus could see it in the way they moved, or rather, in the way they were beginning not to move. Dmitri had stopped swatting his thigh with the birch switch. Aisha was no longer swirling her champagne. Piotr was standing by the glass wall, and his reflection in the dark glass was staring back at him with an expression that was not quite his own, an expression of alertness, of animal wariness, the expression of a man who has heard something that his conscious mind has not yet processed. The power flickered. Not off, flickered. The lights dimmed, the music stuttered, the electronic hum of the heating system cut out for a half-second, and in that half-second the silence was total, and in the silence every person in the room heard the chains. Clink, clink, clink. Piotr, Claudia said, and her voice was sharp, the cold, commanding voice of a woman who is used to being obeyed. Is that part of the... No, Piotr said. His voice was quiet. He was staring at the wall, at the glass wall which was now covered, not with condensation, not with frost, but with something else. A thin, branching pattern of moisture was spreading across the interior surface of the glass, and Marcus recognized it with a cold, sick lurch of his stomach. It was a Lichtenberg figure. The same pattern that he would later see on the glass walls of a different building in a different country. The pattern of an electrical discharge. But there was no lightning here. There was no storm. The sky outside was clear and cold and full of stars, and the mountains were white and still, and the valley was dark, and there was nothing in the sky or the air that could explain the pattern on the glass. The power flickered again. The lights went out. The music stopped. The darkness was sudden and complete, and in the darkness the chains were louder. Clink, clink, clink. Closer now. Much closer. Not in the walls anymore, or not only in the walls, but in the floor, in the ceiling, in the very structure of the house, as though the chains were not being dragged through the building but were being wrapped around it, tightened, drawn close, the way a man draws a rope around a bundle, not to carry it but to compress it, to crush it, to reduce it to something smaller and more manageable. And then the screaming started. It was Aisha. She was standing near the front door and her glass was on the floor and she was staring at the door and the door was wrapped in chains. Not plastic chains, not gold-painted chains. Real chains, thick, rusted iron chains. The links as big around as a man's thumb, and they were wrapped around the door handle and the deadbolt and the hinges, and they were moving. They were tightening. The links drew together with a slow, grinding, metallic screech, and the door frame flexed inward, the wood groaning, the plaster cracking, and Aisha was screaming, and the chains were tightening, and the door was sealed. Marcus ran to the front door and pulled. It did not move. The chains were too tight, too heavy, too many. He pulled again, and the chains clinked, that same rhythmic clink, 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 and the sound was not mechanical. It was organic. It was the sound of something breathing, of something alive, of something that was wrapping itself around the house the way a constrictor wraps itself around a rib cage. And with each breath, each clink, the house drew a fraction tighter, a fraction smaller, a fraction more sealed. "Try the back door," Dmitri shouted, and he ran through the kitchen, and Marcus heard him reach the back door and stop. And the sound that Dmitri made was not a word but a breath, a sharp, involuntary intake of air. The sound a man makes when he opens a door and finds something on the other side that his brain cannot process. Marcus ran to the kitchen. Dmitri was standing in front of the back door, and the back door was chained. Not just wrapped. The chains came through the door frame, through the wood, as though they had been threaded through the structure of the house from the inside, as though the chains had always been there, in the walls, in the floors, in the bones of the building, and had only now chosen to surface, to tighten, to close. "The windows," Claudia shouted, and she was already at the glass wall, pulling at the handle of the sliding door, and the sliding door was chained, and the chains were tighter here. The links pressed against the glass with a force that was bowing the panes inward, and Marcus could see the pattern of condensation on the glass spreading, branching, reaching, and within the pattern, within the moisture, within the Lichtenberg figures, he could see something. A tongue, long, dark, wet. It was pressed against the outside of the glass, and it was licking the window the way a dog licks a bowl, slowly, methodically, from bottom to top, leaving a trail of saliva that was not clear but dark brownish red, and it steamed against the cold glass. And the smell. Oh, the smell, the goat musk, the sulfur, the thick animal barnyard reek that had been in his apartment that morning, that had been the sign, the warning, the announcement of something that was coming, and that was now here. It was outside. It was on the other side of the glass. It was licking the window. And then the lights came back on. Not the main lights, the emergency lights, red, pulsing, embedded in the ceiling, and in their stuttering, arterial glow, Marcus could see the room clearly, and what he saw was this. Every door, every window, every opening to the outside was wrapped in chains. The chains were not on the doors, they were in the doors, growing through the wood and the glass and the metal like vines through a trellis, and the links were tight and close and covered in rust, and what looked like old, dried blood, and they were still moving, still tightening, still clinking with that slow, rhythmic breathing cadence, and the house was being sealed. The 4 catering staff were gone. Marcus realized this with a cold, sudden clarity. The 4 young Austrians with the iron bell pendants were not in the room. They had left. At some point during the flickering, during the chains, during the screaming, they had simply vanished, and Marcus thought of them running through the snow, their iron bells clinking softly against their chests, and he understood. They had known. They had always known. The pendants were not jewelry. They were protection. The bells were not decoration. They were warnings, small, iron-forged warnings that said, "I have been warned. I have heeded the warning. I am not part of this." The party was over. The party had never been a party. The party had been an invitation, and the invitation had been accepted, and the guest was here. The great room was a cage. 20 people, 20, Marcus counted, because 3 of the guests had slipped out through the garage before the chains sealed it, and the 4 catering staff were gone, stood in the red-lit, chain-wrapped, goat musk-filled room and stared at the walls and the windows and the doors and each other, and the fear was no longer small. It was no longer manageable. It was no longer the kind of fear that could be drowned in champagne or dismissed as a prank or rationalized as a ventilation malfunction. It was the kind of fear that changes a person's face, that pulls the skin tight over the cheekbones and widens the eyes and opens the mouth. And Marcus looked around the room at 20 faces that had all, simultaneously, been stripped of everything: wealth, status, sophistication, irony, and reduced to the bare, animal, trembling essence of prey. Dmitri was the first to try to break a window. He picked up a dining chair, white oak, expensive, built by a craftsman in South Tyrol, and swung it at the glass wall with the full force of his large, muscular body, and the chair shattered. The glass did not. The chair broke apart on impact, the wood splintering, the joints exploding, and the glass wall absorbed the blow without cracking, without flexing, without marking, and the chains wrapped around the frame clinked with what sounded, in the terrible, pulsing silence, exactly like amusement. "The glass is treated," Piotr said. His voice was flat, dazed, the voice of a man whose reality has just been disassembled. It's security glass, laminated, it's rated for." "It's not the glass, Piotr," Rebecca said. Everyone turned to look at her. Rebecca Solomon was standing near the kitchen door, and she was the calmest person in the room, not calm the way Claudia was calm by compression, by force of will, but calm the way a person is calm when they have already accepted what is happening and have stopped fighting it. Her face was composed. Her hands were still. And when she spoke, her voice was quiet and clear and carried in the silence like a stone in a still pond. "It's not the glass," she said again. "It's not the chains, it's not the doors. We are not trapped in the house. The house is trapped in him." A sound, not from the walls, not from the chains, from the floor. A click. A single, sharp, percussive click, like a stone striking stone, and then another, and then a third, and the rhythm was the rhythm of walking, slow, deliberate, the walk of something heavy and patient and confident. The sound was coming from the hallway that led from the great room to the bedrooms, and it was getting closer. Click, click, click. "What is that?" Aisha whispered, and her voice cracked on the last word, and the crack was the sound of a person's composure breaking. And once one person's composure broke, the others followed, and the room was filled with the sounds of 20 people breathing too fast. And the red lights pulsed, and the chains clinked, and the clicking grew closer, and Marcus understood, with the same cold animal clarity that had told him that morning that the frost on his rug was not a prank, that the clicking was the sound of hooves. Cloven hooves on marble floors. He appeared in the doorway. Not emerged, not stepped, appeared. One moment the doorway was empty, and the next he was there, filling it, not by entering it but by being in it, as though the doorway had always been a frame for his body and he had simply stepped into his frame. He was tall, 7 feet, perhaps more. It was hard to tell because his form was not fixed, not static, but shifting, moving, the way heat shimmer moves above a road, the way a mirage moves above water. His body was furred, dark, matted, coarse fur, the color of wet earth, and the fur moved, not with wind but with something else, with a current, with a charge, as though each hair were alive and independent. A million tiny, writhing, searching tendrils that tasted the air and the fear and the space between them and the prey. His head was horned. 2 massive, spiraling horns, the color of old bone, rising from his temples and curling backward and upward, and the horns were not smooth. They were ridged, textured, and within the grooves, Marcus could see something moving, something that glinted and shone, and he realized with a surge of nausea that the grooves were filled with metal chains. Fine, thin, iron chains that were threaded through the horns and that connected to the larger chains wrapped around the house, and the chains on the house were the chains on the horns. And the horns and the house and the chains were one thing, one organism, one structure, and Krampus was not inside the house. The house was inside Krampus. His face was long, not human, not animal, something between, something that evolution had tried and discarded, a face that was all jaw and brow and no forehead, with deep-set eyes that glowed the way embers glow, not with light but with heat, a dull, red, banked heat that was the color of rage compressed to its slowest, hottest, most patient burning. His mouth was open and his tongue was long, absurdly, impossibly long, pink and wet and prehensile, and it moved the way a snake moves, tasting the air, and it hung from his jaw to his chest and swayed with his breathing. And the breathing was the clink, clink, clink of the chains, and the chains were his breathing, and the house breathed with him. He carried a sack, a large, coarse burlap sack slung over one shoulder, and the sack was full. Marcus could see the shape of it, lumpy, irregular, the size of a human body, maybe two, and the sack moved. Something inside it was moving, pushing against the fabric, and Marcus heard a sound from inside the sack. Not a scream, not a cry, but a whisper. A thin, reedy, continuous whisper that was the sound of someone who had been screaming for a very long time and had screamed themselves past the capacity for sound and could now only whisper. In his other hand, he held the Ruten. Not one of the dry, dead, ribbon-tied switches from the vase. A living Ruten, a bundle of fresh-cut birch twigs, green and wet and supple, and the twigs were not just cut but grown, still alive, still rooted to something. And the leaves on the twigs were not brown but green, and they rustled with a sound that was not wind but breath, and the Ruten dripped. Not water but something darker, something that steamed when it hit the marble floor, and the smell of it was sulfur and goat musk and copper. Krampus stood in the doorway and looked at the room. His ember eyes moved from face to face, slowly, deliberately, and Marcus felt the gaze pass over him the way a hand passes over a shelf, feeling each object, weighing it, deciding whether to pick it up or leave it. The gaze was heavy. It had weight. When it fell on Marcus, he felt it, a physical pressure on his chest, his shoulders, his skull, as though something were pressing down on him, measuring him, reading the content of his bones, and the gaze found something. It found the guilt. Not a specific guilt, not the leveraged buyback, not the pension funds, not the FCA, but the totality of it, the accumulated weight of a lifetime of calculated harm, and the gaze weighed it, and the gaze was satisfied, and it moved on. It moved to Dmitri. The large Russian was standing with his back to the glass wall, his Krampus mask still pushed up on his forehead, his face white, his hands hanging at his sides, and Krampus looked at him, and the gaze lingered, and the ember eyes brightened, and the tongue slid out further, tasting the air between them, and Marcus saw on Dmitri's face the moment of recognition, the moment when the large, powerful, confident man who had survived the privatization wars and the oligarch feuds and the poisonings and the bombings looked at the thing in the doorway and knew, with absolute, bone-deep, marrow-level certainty, that he was looking at something worse than anything he had ever encountered. Something that could not be bribed, could not be intimidated, could not be killed, because it was not alive in the way that things were alive, because it was not a thing but a function, a process, a judgment, and judgments do not die because judgments are not born. Krampus moved. He did not walk, he did not step. He displaced, one moment in the doorway, the next 3 feet closer, the next 3 feet closer still, moving in a series of sudden, discontinuous jumps that were not jumps but shifts, as though reality were a film strip and Krampus were advancing one frame at a time. Each frame bringing him closer, each advance accompanied by a single clink of the chains, and the guests scrambled backward, and some of them screamed, and some of them were silent, and Marcus saw that Krampus was not moving toward the group. He was moving toward Dmitri. He had selected him, the first harvest. Dmitri tried to run. He turned and threw himself at the glass wall, and the glass held, and Dmitri hit it with his shoulder and his face, and his nose broke with a wet, flat crack, and the blood splattered the glass. And within the blood, the Lichtenberg figures on the glass pulsed and brightened, as though the blood were a conductor, as though the pattern on the glass were feeding on it. And Dmitri slid down the wall, leaving a smear of red, and Krampus was there. He was there the way a shadow is there when the light changes, suddenly, completely, without transition. One moment he was 6 feet away, and the next he was beside Dmitri and his hand, His large, black-nailed, fur-covered hand reached down and gripped Dmitri by the back of the neck, and Dmitri made a sound, not a scream. A sound lower than a scream, a sound that came from the abdomen, from the gut, from the place where the body stores the knowledge of its own mortality. And the sound was the sound of a man being lifted by something that was stronger than anything he had ever known. And the strength was not physical. Krampus did not strain, did not grip, did not exert, but absolute, the way gravity is absolute, the way the cold is absolute, and Dmitri hung from the hand the way a man hangs from a cliff, supported not by the strength of the thing holding him but by the fact of it. The Ruten came up. Krampus raised the bundle of wet, green, living birch twigs, and he looked at Dmitri's face, the broken nose, the blood, the wide, white, terrified eyes, and the ember eyes were steady, and the tongue slid across Dmitri's cheek, tasting the blood, and the tasting was not hunger. It was assessment. It was the way a doctor tastes a patient's sweat for salt, the way a jeweler tests a stone for hardness. Krampus was assessing the quality of the sin, and the sin was heavy. Marcus could feel it, not his own sin but Dmitri's, the accumulated weight of a life built on the bodies of others, and the weight was real, it was physical. It had mass and density, and it pressed against the air between them like a stone, and Krampus weighed it and found it sufficient. The Ruten came down. The sound was not the sound of a stick hitting skin. It was the sound of something tearing, of something being separated from something else, and Marcus realized what the Ruten did. It did not beat. It flayed. Not the skin, the sin. The birch twigs struck Dmitri's back, and where they struck, something came away, not blood, not flesh, but a substance that was darker than blood and more solid than flesh, a substance that writhed and twisted and steamed, and Marcus recognized it with a horror that went beyond understanding. It was the guilt. The Ruten was pulling the guilt out of Dmitri's body, peeling it away from his flesh the way a man peels bark from a tree, and the guilt was tangible, physical, a thing that could be touched and held and removed. And Dmitri screamed, not from pain but from the sensation of having something extracted that had been part of him for so long that he had forgotten it was there. And the extraction was agony because the guilt was rooted. It was grown into him. It had tendrils and hooks and anchors that reached into every part of his body, and the Ruten was pulling them all out at once. Krampus struck again, and again, and again. Each strike was measured, deliberate, precise, not the frenzied beating of an animal but the methodical, professional work of a craftsman removing a substance from a substrate, and the substance was Dmitri's sin, and the substrate was Dmitri's soul, and the work was thorough. Marcus watched as the dark, writhing mass of extracted guilt accumulated on the floor beneath Dmitri's hanging body, and the mass was enormous. It was larger than Dmitri himself, which meant that the guilt inside Dmitri was larger than Dmitri, which meant that the man had been hollow, had been a shell around his sin, and the shell was being emptied, and what was left when the sin was gone was not a redeemed man but a husk, a dry, rattling, empty thing that had once been a person, and was now a container with nothing left to contain. Dmitri stopped screaming. His eyes went flat. His body went limp. The guilt was gone, all of it, the entire mass, a pile of dark, steaming, writhing substance on the marble floor that was already beginning to dissolve, to break down, to return to whatever dark, primordial place it had come from. And Dmitri was empty, and Krampus opened the sack. He did not put Dmitri in the sack. He folded Dmitri. He compressed the large, limp body with his hands, the way a man compresses a garment for storage, and the body folded, not breaking, not bending in a way that bones should bend, but folding, collapsing, the limbs drawing inward, the torso compressing, the head sinking between the shoulders, and Dmitri became smaller and smaller and denser until he was the size of a pillow, and Krampus placed him in the sack with the others, and the sack whispered. The whole thing had taken 90 seconds. Krampus turned back to the room. His ember eyes swept the faces, and the tongue tasted the air, and Marcus felt the gaze pass over him again, lighter this time, still weighing, still measuring, but not yet ready, and it moved on. It moved to Jean-Luc. The art dealer was standing by the fireplace. The fireplace where, 2 hours ago, he had burned the birch switch and toasted the old one and laughed. He was not laughing now. His face was gray and his hands were shaking, and the wine glass was on the floor in a pool of red that looked, in the red light, like something darker. And Krampus moved toward him with that same frame-by-frame displacement, and each frame brought a clink, and Jean-Luc pressed himself against the mantelpiece and said, "No, no, please. I didn't know. It was just a party. It was just a—" The Ruten took him in the chest. Not a strike, a thrust, a single driving, precise thrust that drove the bundle of twigs into Jean-Luc's sternum, and Jean-Luc's mouth opened, and what came out was not a scream but a sound. A wet, tearing, organic sound, like the sound of a root being pulled from wet earth, and something came out of his mouth. Not vomit, not blood, a shape. A long, dark, writhing shape that was the physical manifestation of Jean-Luc's lifetime of deception. The forgeries, the trafficking, the stolen provenance, the art that had been taken from murdered families and sold to wealthy collectors who did not ask questions. And the shape climbed out of his throat and along the birch twigs and into Krampus's hand. And Krampus held it the way a fisherman holds a catch, examining it, weighing it, and the shape was still connected to Jean-Luc by a thin, dark, pulsing thread that ran from the thing in Krampus's hand to the back of Jean-Luc's throat. And Jean-Luc was choking, gagging, his eyes bulging, and Krampus pulled. The thread broke. The shape was free. Jean-Luc collapsed, and his body did the same thing Dimitri's had done. It folded, it compressed. It became small and dense and empty, and Krampus placed him in the sack, and the sack whispered, and the chains clinked, and the old one turned back to the room. 2 down, 18 to go. The next hour was the longest hour of Marcus Brennan's life. It was not a continuous hour. It was broken, fractured, divided into segments by the intervals between the takings. And each interval was worse than the last, because each interval was filled with the waiting, the not knowing, the terrible, suffocating uncertainty of who would be next, and the certainty that someone would be, and the growing, dawning, horrible understanding that the selection was not random. Krampus was judging them. He moved through the room, and he tasted the air, and he weighed what he found, and some he took and some he passed, and the pattern was clear, was devastatingly, ruthlessly clear. He took the guilty. Not the relatively guilty, not the mildly guilty, not the guilty in the way that all humans are guilty. He took the specifically, calculatedly, premeditatedly guilty. He took the ones who had done things that they knew were wrong and had done them anyway, not out of passion or desperation or ignorance, but out of choice, out of the cold, clear, deliberate exercise of power against people who could not resist. Claudia was third. The pharmaceutical executive, the contaminated blood products, the developing world markets, the cost-benefit analysis that had concluded that settling the lawsuits was cheaper than recalling the product. Krampus held her by the throat and looked into her eyes, and the Ruten peeled the sin from her body in long, dark, ribbon-like strips that coiled on the floor like snakes. And her sin was cold. Marcus could feel it from across the room. A cold so deep and so sharp that it made the air around her feel like January. And the sin was not one act but a pattern, a life, a methodology, and it was vast. It was enormous. It was the size of the room, and when it was gone, Claudia folded, and the sack whispered, and the chains clinked. Pieter was fourth, the shipping magnate, the sunken vessel, the crew that had been aboard. Krampus did not use the Ruten on Pieter, he used the chains. The chains that were wrapped around the house unwound themselves from the door frames and the window frames and crawled across the floor to Pieter, and they wrapped around his legs and his arms and his chest, and they tightened, and the tightening was not crushing but extracting. The chains drew the sin out of him the way a tourniquet draws blood, and Pieter's sin was liquid, dark, flowing, and it ran along the chains and into the walls and was absorbed, and Pieter was emptied, and he folded, and the sack whispered. Aisha was fifth. Jean-Luc was already gone. Two of the minor guests, a Swedish banker named Lars who had been implicated in a money laundering scheme, and a Brazilian real estate developer named Felipe who had ordered the clearing of an indigenous settlement, were sixth and seventh. Each taking was different. Each taking was specific. The Ruten for the liars, the chains for the thieves, the sack for the killers, and each taking was preceded by the assessment, the tasting, the weighing, the slow, deliberate, professional evaluation of the quality and quantity of the sin, and each taking was followed by the same result. The empty body, the fold, the whisper of the sack, the clink of the chains. Marcus watched from a corner of the room. He had retreated there when Krampus had entered, pressing himself against the wall beside the fireplace, and he had not moved since, and he had watched 7 people die in the sense that they were alive and then they were not, they were people and then they were husks, they were full and then they were empty, and the fear in his chest was no longer a small, cold mass. It was a living thing. It was the size of the room. It was the size of the house. It was the size of his entire, accumulated, carefully constructed, meticulously defended life, and it was pressing against the inside of his chest with a force that made his ribs creak, and he held it, not because he was brave, not because he had Goro's discipline or Daniel's training, but because holding it was the only thing he knew how to do, the only skill he had, the talent for suppression and control, and the refusal to acknowledge what was real that had made him a fortune. And that was now, in this red-lit, chain-wrapped, goat-musk-filled room on the side of an Austrian mountain, the only thing keeping him alive. Because Krampus had not taken him. The gaze had passed over him twice, and both times it had lingered and both times it had moved on. And Marcus did not know why. His sin was as heavy as anyone's, heavier than most, lighter than some. And the fact that the Old One had not selected him was not a comfort. It was a torment. It meant that the judgment was not finished. It meant that Krampus was still deciding. It meant that Marcus was still on the menu, and the meal was not over, and the chef was taking his time. 11 people remained in the room. Marcus, Rebecca, and 9 others. 5 villa owners and 4 guests who had been, apparently, insufficiently sinful to warrant immediate attention, but who were now standing in the room with the certain knowledge that their assessment was ongoing, that the tasting was continuing, that the Old One was still circling, still weighing, still deciding. And then Rebecca spoke. "We need to go to the cellar," she said. Marcus stared at her. "The cellar." "The cellar, this house has a basement, a wine cellar. It's reinforced concrete. No windows, 1 door if we can get to it." "The chains," someone said. "The chains are on every door." "The chains are on the outside," Rebecca said. "The cellar door is interior. It's in the hallway. The chains are on the exterior doors, the front, the back, the windows. The cellar is internal." Marcus looked at her. Rebecca Solomon, the gemologist, the woman with the silence about the conflict diamonds and the vanished business partner, the woman who had been calm from the beginning, who had said, "We are not trapped in the house. The house is trapped in him," and who was now in the middle of a nightmare, thinking clearly enough to remember the architectural layout of a house that was not hers. "Can we reach it?" he asked. "The hallway is clear. He came through it, but the chains are on the doors, not the corridors. If we move fast, stay together, get to the cellar door." "The hallway is where he is," someone said. It was one of the guests, a British woman named Elena who had been dating Pieter and who was now standing in the center of the room with her arms wrapped around herself and her face the color of parchment. "He's in the hallway. He moves through the hallway." "He's in the room," Rebecca said. "He's always in the room. He's in the walls, he's in the chains, he's everywhere. But he manifests where he chooses, and right now he is." She looked at the doorway. It was empty. The Ruten-wielding, sack-carrying, tongue-licking physical form of Krampus was not visible. He had not left. He was still in the house, still in the chains, still in the air. But his body, his manifest body, was elsewhere. in the walls, in the floors, somewhere that was not the hallway. "Now," Rebecca said, "move now." They moved. 11 people, running, stumbling, crashing into each other, pouring through the doorway into the hallway, and Marcus was among them. And the hallway was dark and cold and smelled of sulfur and wet fur, and the goat musk was so thick here that he could taste it, and the red emergency lights were not on in the hallway. The hallway was lit by something else, a faint blue-white glow that came from the walls themselves, from the chains that were threaded through the drywall and the studs, and the chains were vibrating, humming, a low, deep, resonant hum that was the sound of the house breathing, the sound of Krampus breathing, and Marcus ran through the breath of the old one and felt it on his face, warm and wet and alive. The cellar door was at the end of the hallway, a heavy wooden door set in a concrete frame with a manual latch. No chains, no locks, just the latch. Rebecca reached it first and threw it open, and beyond was a stairwell descending into darkness, and the darkness was different. Not the blue-white, sulfur-tinged darkness of the house, but the simple, clean, mineral darkness of concrete and earth, and Marcus could feel the difference the way he had felt the difference between the fire-rated corridor and the tile floor in a different building in a different country. The difference between a space that was occupied and a space that was not. They went down, 11 people pouring down the stairs, the last one pulling the door shut behind them and the latch engaged, and they were in the cellar. The cellar was cold and dark and smelled of concrete and wine. Pieter's wine cellar was stocked floor to ceiling with bottles, but no one was interested in the wine. They sat on the floor, on the cold concrete in the dark, and they listened, and above them the house breathed. Clink, clink, clink. The chains were still tightening. The house was still being sealed, but they were in the cellar, and the cellar was concrete, and the chains were not in the concrete, and the air was clean, and they were, for the moment, safe. Rebecca found the light, a battery-powered emergency lantern on a shelf among the wine. She turned it on, and the yellow light filled the cellar, and the faces of 11 people were illuminated, and Marcus looked at them and saw what the old one had left, the less guilty, the ones whose sins were not sufficient, not yet, not for this night, the ones who had been passed over. And he saw on the faces of every one of them the same expression, the expression of people who know that passed over does not mean spared, it means later. They stayed in the cellar for 3 hours. 3 hours of sitting in the cold and the dark and the mineral silence of concrete, listening to the chains above them, clink, 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 and the breathing of the house, and the occasional distant, terrible sounds that were not sounds but the absence of sounds, the moments when the chains fell silent and the breathing stopped and the house held itself still. And in that stillness they heard something else, a whispering. Not the whispering of the sack. That sound had been growing fainter as the night progressed, as though the sack were filling up, as though the contents were being compressed and consolidated and stored. This whispering was different. It was the whispering of the house itself, the whispering of the walls and the floors and the ceiling, and it was not words but texture, the sound of a structure being stressed, being compressed, being reshaped by something that did not understand or care about architecture. The 11 survivors sat in a circle, the lantern in the center, and they did not speak. There was nothing to say. The facts were clear. 7 of their number had been taken, judged and flayed and emptied and folded and stuffed into a sack that whispered with the compressed souls of the guilty. The remaining 11 were hiding in a wine cellar beneath a house that had become the body of a creature from alpine folklore, and the creature was still above them, and the night was not over. Marcus broke first, not in a dramatic way. He did not scream or weep or collapse. He broke the way ice breaks, with a single, sharp, decisive crack that ran through his composure and split it, and what came out was not emotion but calculation, the cold, reflexive, self-preserving calculation of a man whose entire life had been a series of strategic retreats from consequences. "We need to get out of here," he said. "Not wait, not hide, get out." "The chains," Alina began. "Have you tried the cellar? There's a ventilation shaft. Every one of these villas has a ventilation shaft that runs from the cellar to the roof. It's part of the building code, passive ventilation. It's a concrete tube, no metal, no chains, if we can get into it. And go where? Rebecca said. Her voice was quiet. She was sitting across from him, her back against the wall, her knees drawn up, and her face in the lantern light was calm and still and old. Out, into the snow, into the night. The chains are on the house, Marcus. What do you think is out there? Marcus stared at her. The village. The village is a mile down the road. We walk. You don't understand, Rebecca said. I tried before I came down here. When the chains first started, when the doors sealed, I went to the window. The back window, the one in the bedroom. I looked out, and the road was gone. A silence. The chains clinked above. The road was gone, Marcus repeated. Not gone, changed. The road was there, but it didn't go to the village. It went to the mountain. It went up. And the trees were wrong. They were too tall, too close. And the snow was not white, it was gray. And there was a smell, not the goat smell, not the sulfur, something else, something older, something that smelled like the inside of a cave. She looked at the ceiling. The chains clinked. He's not just in the house, Marcus. He's around the house. He's pulled the house somewhere, somewhere that isn't here, somewhere that... The hinterland, said a voice, a new voice, from the corner of the cellar. Everyone turned. Sitting in the corner in the shadow beyond the lantern's reach was one of the villa owners Marcus did not know well, a Norwegian woman named Astrid, who had purchased her villa 6 months ago and who had kept to herself, attending the parties but never speaking, never drinking, never participating in the jokes or the gossip or the ritualistic mutual reassurance of the expatriate community. She was thin and pale and dark-haired, and she was looking at the ceiling with an expression that Marcus had not seen before on her face, an expression of recognition, as though the chains and the breathing and the whispering were not a surprise but a confirmation. The hinterland, she said again. My grandmother talked about it. She was from the mountains, not these mountains, the mountains in the north, but the idea is the same. The old one doesn't just come to your house. He takes your house. He pulls it into the space between the worlds, the space that is not here and not there but is the place where the old things live, the place where physics is not physics, where space is not space, where the size of a room depends on the weight of the guilt inside it. She looked at Marcus. How big does this cellar feel to you? Marcus blinked. He looked around. The cellar was the size of a large room, perhaps 6 meters by 8 with a ceiling of about 3 meters. It had felt that size when they entered. It felt that size now. Except that the wine racks along the far wall seemed further away than they had been, and the ceiling seemed higher, and the door through which they had entered seemed further away, set into a wall that had been 3 meters from the center of the room and now felt like 5, and Marcus realized that Astrid was right. The room was bigger. The room was growing. Not because the walls were moving, but because the space was stretching, expanding, the dimensions of the room increasing as though the room were a balloon and something were inflating it, and the air was thinner, and the distance between the people in the circle was greater, and the lantern seemed smaller and dimmer, and Marcus understood with a sick, vertiginous lurch. The house was growing because the guilt was growing. The guilt of the 11 survivors, accumulated and compressed and held in check, was now expanding in the space of the hinterland, and the space was expanding to accommodate it, and the house was becoming a world, and the world was made of guilt. The corridors, someone said. It was one of the guests, a German man named Werner who had been quiet the entire night. The corridors will be longer. The stairs will lead back to the room we left. The space will loop. It's a trap. He's made the house into a trap. We stay here, Marcus said. We stay in the cellar. We wait until morning. Until morning, Elinor said, and her voice was thin, cracking, the voice of a woman who has passed through fear and emerged on the other side into a kind of desperate, brittle clarity. You want to wait until morning. We can hear him up there. He's still taking people. There were others, guests, staff. The staff are gone, Rebecca said. The catering staff left before the chain sealed. They had the bells, they were warned, they were protected. Protected by what? A bell. By obedience, Rebecca said. By the tradition, they respected it. They wore the bells, they heeded the warning. They left before the night began. They were not part of the invitation. We were the invitation. We lit the fire and burned the birch and mocked the old one, and that was the invitation, and he accepted it and he came. The chains fell silent. The breathing stopped. The house held itself still, and in that stillness, a stillness so absolute, so complete, so fundamentally, physically wrong that Marcus felt it in his teeth and his eardrums and the roots of his hair, there was a sound, not from above. From the door, the cellar door. A sound like a nail being drawn slowly across wood, a thin, high, sustained scraping that set Marcus's nerves alight and made every hair on his body stand straight, and the scraping was followed by a clicking. The clicking of hooves, on the stairs. He was coming down. "Move," Marcus shouted, and the word was barely out of his mouth before the lantern went out. Not flickered, not dimmed, but went out, as though the flame had been pinched by invisible fingers, and the cellar was plunged into absolute darkness. And in the darkness, the clicking grew louder. Closer, more deliberate, and the smell of sulfur and goat musk rolled down the stairs like a tide, filling the cellar, coating the air, and Marcus heard, behind him, the sound of someone running, not away from the stairs but toward the far wall where the ventilation shaft was. It was Rebecca. He heard her footsteps, quick and purposeful, crossing the cellar floor, and he heard her hands on the wall feeling for the vent cover, and he heard the scrape of metal as she pried it free, and he thought, the ventilation shaft, the way out. The concrete tube that ran from the cellar to the roof, no chains, no metal, a path through the bones of the house to the outside. And he thought, I need to get there first. He ran. In the dark, in the absolute, sulphurous, goat musk darkness of the cellar, he ran toward the sound of Rebecca's hands on the wall, and he was faster than her. He was taller, longer-legged, and he had been a runner at university, and the muscle memory was still there. The stride, the pace, the efficiency, and he reached the wall at the same time as she did, and their hands met in the dark, both of them reaching for the vent opening, and Marcus gripped the edge of the shaft and began to pull himself up, and Rebecca gripped his ankle. "Let go," Marcus said. "Move over," Rebecca said. "There's room for two." "There's not, the shaft is narrow, one at a time. I'll go first and pull you up." "No," Rebecca said. "You'll go first and leave me." "I won't." "Marcus," her voice was steady, calm, the same calm that had been there from the beginning, the calm of a woman who had already accepted what was happening and who was not fighting it but navigating it, the way a sailor navigates a storm, not by resisting the wind but by reading it. "I know what you are. I've known since I moved here. We're the same. We're all the same. But I also know what you're going to do because it's what I would do, what any of us would do. You're going to save yourself." Clicking on the stairs was louder, much louder, at the bottom now, in the cellar. And there was a sound that was worse than the clicking, a wet, heavy breathing sound, the sound of something large and furred and warm that was standing in the dark at the foot of the stairs, and filling the space with its presence the way water fills a vessel. And the air was thick, unbreathable, saturated with sulfur and musk, and the cold, patient, professional attention of something that had come to judge, and that was not finished judging. Marcus made his decision. He did not make it the way a good person makes a decision, with deliberation, with weighing, with the consideration of consequences and the rights of others. He made it the way a predator makes a decision, instantly, reflexively, without thought, with the single, focused, animal intent of survival. He kicked. He kicked Rebecca's hand from his ankle, and the kick was hard, accurate, the kick of a man who has decided that the person below him is not a person but an obstacle, and the obstacle must be removed, and the removal must be immediate. Rebecca's grip broke. She fell or stumbled, and Marcus pulled himself into the shaft, and he did not look back, and he did not reach down, and behind him in the dark cellar he heard Rebecca hit the floor, and he heard her say one word. Not a curse, not a plea, not his name, but a single, quiet, steady word. Yes. And then the cellar erupted. Not with sound, with presence. The thing at the foot of the stairs moved, and the movement was not a movement but an expansion, a filling, a sudden total occupation of the space, and Marcus heard the other survivors scream, 9 voices, 9 screams overlapping, harmonizing in their terror, and the screams were cut short, one by one, not by silence but by the clink of chains, the whisper of the sack, the wet, tearing sound of the Ruten doing its work, and Marcus climbed. He climbed the ventilation shaft, his hands on the concrete, his knees braced against the walls, his body a piston of desperation, and behind him, below him, the sounds of judgment continued. Clink, tear, whisper, clink, tear, whisper, and the chains tightened, and the house breathed, and the old one worked. He was 20 feet up the shaft when the cold air hit him. Not the cold air of the cellar, the cold air of the outside, the real outside, the alpine winter night air that was thin and sharp and smelled of pine and snow and the mineral breath of the mountain. And Marcus climbed faster, pulling himself up the concrete tube with his fingernails and his kneecaps. And the shaft was narrow and dark and rough, and his hands were bleeding, and his knees were raw, but the air was clean, 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 and the sulfur was gone, and the goat musk was gone, and above him he could see a square of black sky pricked with stars, and the stars were the most beautiful things he had ever seen. He was 30 feet up when he heard it. Below him, in the shaft, the clicking, not on the stairs, on the walls, the hooves on the concrete, climbing. The old one was in the shaft, the ventilation shaft, the one path that was supposed to be safe, the one route that was supposed to be free of chains and metal and the creature's reach, and Marcus realized with a cold, sick, final understanding, there was no safe path. There was no escape route. There was no way out of the hinterland that did not go through the old one, because the old one was the hinterland, and the house was the old one, and the shaft was the house, and the house was him. He climbed faster. His hands were slipping on the blood-slicked concrete. His knees were screaming. The clicking was closer, 5 feet below, 3 feet, 1 foot, and he could feel the heat of the creature's breath on the soles of his feet, and the heat was not metaphorical. It was real, physical, a warm, wet, sulphurous exhalation that reached his skin through his shoes and his socks, and filled the shaft with the smell of goat and sulphur and the copper tang of blood. And Marcus knew, with the absolute, bone-deep, marrow-level certainty of a man who has run out of options, that he was going to die. But the square of sky was above him. He could see it, 10 feet, 5 feet. He reached the top of the shaft and pulled himself out onto the roof, and the cold hit him like a wall, clean, sharp, beautiful, electric, and he rolled onto the flat, snowy surface of the roof and gasped, and the stars blazed above him, and the air was clean, and for one moment, one single, perfect, crystalline moment, he thought he had made it. He stood up. He looked around. The roof was flat and covered with snow, and the snow was white. Not the gray snow that Rebecca had described, but real, clean, alpine white. And the sky was clear and full of stars, and the mountains were around him, white peaks against the black sky, and the valley was below, dark and deep. And he could see the lights of Hinterthal, the village, a cluster of warm, yellow, electric lights a mile away, and they were the most beautiful lights he had ever seen. He took a step toward the edge of the roof. He would climb down. He would jump if he had to. He would run through the snow, bare-handed, barefooted if necessary, and he would reach the village, and he would be safe, and this would be over, and he would leave the Alps and never come back, and he would. The snow crunched behind him. Marcus turned. The ventilation shaft was there, the square opening in the roof, and something was coming out of it. Not climbing, emerging. Rising. The way a whale rises from the water, slowly, massively, with a fluid, heavy inevitability that made resistance not just futile but irrelevant. The shape that emerged from the shaft was not the shape that had stood in the doorway of the great room. It was larger, much larger. It had grown. The night of feeding, the extraction of sin from 9 guilty people had nourished it, had expanded it, had added mass and substance and presence, and the thing that stood on the roof with Marcus was not 7 feet tall. It was the size of the house. Its horns reached into the sky. Its fur was the darkness between the stars. Its eyes were not embers anymore. They were furnaces, deep, red, burning with a heat that Marcus could feel on his face from 20 feet away. A heat that was not the heat of fire but the heat of judgment, the heat of something that has been patient for a very long time and that has finally found the last of the guilty and is ready to complete the work. The tongue slid out, long, wet, dark. It tasted the air, it tasted Marcus. And Marcus ran. He ran across the roof, through the snow, toward the edge, toward the valley, toward the lights of the village, toward anything, everything. The desperate, futile, magnificent sprint of a man who knows he cannot outrun the thing behind him but who runs anyway because running is the only thing left. The last human act. The final, defiant, meaningless gesture of a creature that was born to flee, and that will flee until it cannot. He reached the edge of the roof. He looked down. The drop was 3 stories to the snow below. He jumped. He hit the snow hard. His ankle snapped. A sharp, clean, decisive crack that sent a bolt of white pain up his leg and into his hip and his spine. And he screamed and rolled and came up on his hands and his one good knee. And the snow was cold and clean and real, and the lights of the village were ahead, and he began to crawl. Behind him on the roof, Krampus watched. He did not pursue. He did not need to. He stood on the roof of the house that was his body, and he watched the crawling figure in the snow. And his ember eyes, no, his furnace eyes, were steady and patient, and the chains clinked once softly like a sigh, and the Ruten hung at his side dripping, and the sack was on his shoulder whispering, and the old one watched Marcus Brennan crawl through the snow toward the village and did not move, because he did not need to move, because Marcus was not crawling toward safety. Marcus was crawling toward frost. The frost appeared under Marcus's hands. A circle of frost, perfect, geometric, crystalline, spreading across the snow beneath his palms with the same branching, fractal, vein-like pattern that had been on his rug that morning. And Marcus felt the cold, not the cold of the snow but the cold of the frost, the cold of the thing that made the frost, the cold of the old one's touch. And he stopped crawling and he looked down, and the frost was spreading up his arms, across his chest, over his face, and it was not freezing him. It was claiming him. A sound behind him, not a roar, not a growl, a bleat, a low, guttural animal bleat. The sound a goat makes when it is not frightened and not angry but simply present, simply alive, simply doing what goats do, and the bleat was the sound of Krampus announcing himself, and Marcus felt the hand on his ankle, the large, black-nailed, fur-covered hand, and the grip was not strong. It did not need to be. It was absolute. Krampus dragged Marcus across the snow, slowly, the chains rattling in a slow, rhythmic cadence, not the clink-clink-clink of the hunting, but a slower, heavier, more deliberate sound, the sound of a procession, a march toward a place from which there is no return. Marcus clawed at the snow. His fingers tore. His broken ankle dragged. The frost spread across his body, and the cold was inside him now, in his bones, in his blood, in the marrow, and the cold was not temperature. The cold was judgment. The cold was the weight of everything he had done, everything he had taken, everything he had destroyed, and the weight was crushing him, compressing him, folding him the way the others had been folded. And Marcus opened his mouth to scream, and what came out was not a scream but the whisper. The thin, reedy, continuous whisper of someone who had been screaming for a very long time and had screamed past the capacity for sound. Krampus dragged him to the cellar door. The door was open. The stairs descended into darkness. And from the darkness the chains clinked and the house breathed, and the whisper of the sack grew louder, and Marcus Brennan, CEO, expatriate, sinner, prey, was pulled into the dark. Rebecca was in the cellar when it happened. She had not climbed the shaft. She had not run. When Marcus had kicked her hand free and she had fallen to the floor, she had stayed on the floor. She had lain on the cold concrete with the sulfur and the goat musk and the dark, and she had felt the old one move past her, through her, around her, over her, and she had not moved and he had not stopped. He had taken the others. One by one, in the dark, the clink and the tear and the whisper, and Rebecca had lain on the floor and listened and not moved. And when the cellar was empty and the old one had gone up the shaft after Marcus, Rebecca had stood up. She did not go up the shaft. She knew what waited above. She knew because of the frost. Instead, she went to the ventilation shaft, the same shaft Marcus had climbed, the same shaft Krampus had emerged from, and she looked at it, and she saw that the concrete was cracked, that the walls of the shaft were no longer smooth but rough, organic, as though the shaft had been reshaped by the passage of something too large for it. And she saw at the bottom of the shaft a gap, a crack in the concrete where the shaft met the cellar wall, a gap that had not been there before, a gap that opened not into the house but into the space behind the house, the hinterland, the space between, the pocket of the alpine wilderness where physics were dictated by guilt. And through the gap she felt air, cold air, clean air, not the sulphurous goat musk air of the house, mountain air, real air. The air of the world outside the hinterland, leaking through a crack in the boundary between the two, and Rebecca pressed her face to the gap and breathed it, and the air was cold and sharp and smelled of pine and snow and the mineral breath of the mountain, and she began to work at the crack with her hands, widening it, pulling the concrete apart. And the concrete crumbled like clay, because in the hinterland, concrete was not concrete. It was guilt, and her guilt was lighter than the others, lighter because she had done something that none of them had done. Something that she had not realized she had done until this moment, lying on the cellar floor while the old one took the others around her. She had admitted it. Not out loud, not to anyone but to herself. In the dark on the floor, with the chains clinking and the Ruten tearing and the sack whispering, she had admitted what she had done. The conflict diamonds, the vanished business partner, the lies, the evasions, the carefully constructed silence that was not privacy but cowardice. And the admission had been a weight. But it had been her weight, and she had carried it, and the carrying had made her lighter, and the lightness had made her invisible, not to the old one's eyes but to his judgment, because judgment requires denial, and Rebecca had stopped denying. The crack widened. She pulled and tore and pushed, and the concrete crumbled, and the air grew colder and cleaner, and the gap became large enough for her body, and she squeezed through it, not into the hinterland but through the hinterland, through the boundary, through the skin of the pocket, and the passage was tight and dark and cold and smelled of sulphur and pine, and the walls pressed against her. And she could feel the hinterland trying to hold her, trying to keep her, the guilt trying to anchor her, and she pushed against it with her hands and her feet and her will and her admission. And the admission was not enough. She had sinned. She had done terrible things, and the hinterland knew it. But the admission plus something else, something that the hinterland could not resist, the truth. Not the admission of guilt, but the refusal to hide from it. The willingness to be seen, fully, completely, without excuse or explanation or the elegant, expensive, expatriate distance that the others had wrapped themselves in like fur coats. She fell. She fell through the gap and onto snow, real snow, clean snow, the snow of the Austrian Alps at 5 in the morning, and the air was freezing and thin and beautiful, and she was outside the house. She was outside the house and on the ground, and the house was behind her. She could see it dark and silent, the glass walls cracked, the doors chained, the interior dark, and the chains were still, and the breathing had stopped, and the house was no longer the old one's body. It was a house, just a house, a glass and concrete statement of minimalist wealth on the side of an Austrian mountain, and it was empty. Rebecca stood up. She was shaking. Her hands were bleeding, her clothes were torn, her hair was full of concrete dust, and she could smell the sulphur still, faintly, a ghost of the night, and she began to walk, not toward the village, not yet. She was not ready for the village, for the people, for the eyes. She walked toward the gate of the gated community, the wrought iron gate that separated the expatriate enclave from the village road, and she reached it and pushed it open, and the gate was not chained. The chains had been on the house. The gate was free. She walked through the gate and into the snow of the village road, and the road went down, down, toward the village, toward the lights, toward the warmth, and Rebecca walked, and with each step, the air grew cleaner and the sky grew lighter and the mountain grew more solid and more real and more beautiful, and the hinterland was behind her, and the old one was behind her, and the night was behind her, and she was. She stopped. She reached into her coat pocket. She did not know why her hand moved on its own, an instinct, a reflex, the body doing something the mind had not yet authorized. Her fingers found something, something small, something cold, something that clinked. She pulled it out. In the pre-dawn light she looked at it. A bell, small, iron, hand-forged. The kind of bell that the villagers wore on chains around their necks. The kind of bell that said, "I have been warned. I have heeded the warning. I am not part of this." And beside it in the same pocket a twig, a birch twig, wet, pale, stripped of bark. The same kind of twig that had been on Marcus's pillow. The same kind of twig that had not burned in his fireplace. The same kind of twig that was the Ruten, the instrument of punishment, the instrument of correction, the instrument of the old one. Rebecca stood in the snow on the village road, and the sky was growing light, and the sun was touching the peaks, and the mountains were turning from black to gray to white to gold, and she held the bell in one hand and the twig in the other, and she understood. The debt was paid. She had been judged, she had been measured, she had been found guilty because she was guilty, and she had been found willing because she had admitted it, and the admission had been her birch strike, her single, accepted, acknowledged punishment, and it had been enough. Not enough to absolve her, not enough to erase what she had done, but enough to release her, enough to let her walk through the gate and into the snow and toward the village with the understanding that the old one did not forgive, because forgiveness was not his function. His function was to judge and to punish and to release, and the release was not mercy. The release was the acknowledgement that the punished had accepted the punishment, and that acceptance was the only thing that could break the creature's fixation. She put the bell back in her pocket. She put the twig back in her pocket. She began to walk again down the road, toward the village, and the snow was clean under her feet, and the air was cold in her lungs, and the sun was rising over the Alps, and Rebecca Solomon walked toward the light and the warmth and the sound of human voices and the smell of bread baking and the sight of smoke rising from chimneys, and she was alive, and she was free, and she would carry the bell and the twig and the memory of the cloven hoof clicking on the marble floor for every remaining day of her life. She would never hear the sound of chains without flinching. She would never smell goat musk without freezing. She would never see frost on a window without feeling the hinterland pressing against the edges of the world, waiting, patient, eternal, the old one in his mountain, the old one in his deep winter, the old one who did not forgive and did not forget and did not accept the excuse that you did not know. Because now she knew, and knowing was the only debt that could never be paid. 6 months later, Rebecca Solomon sat in a cafe in Cape Town, and a man at the next table jingled his keys, and the keys made a sound, a small, metallic, rhythmic clinking, and Rebecca's hand went to her pocket, where the bell still rested, where the twig still lay, and she held them. And she breathed, and she waited for the sound to stop, and it did, and the world continued, and the sun shone, and the coffee was hot, and the mountains in the distance were not the Alps but were mountains nonetheless. And mountains, she now knew, were never just mountains. Mountains were the border. Mountains were the edge. Mountains were the place where the world ended and the hinterland began, and the hinterland was always there on the other side of the snow, on the other side of the silence, on the other side of the dark, and the old one was always there, in the hinterland, in the chains, in the birch, in the frost, in the clink-clink-clink of something heavy and patient and eternal that was coming, that was always coming, that would come on the night of the Ruten, and that would find the guilty, and that would judge them, and that would not stop until the judgment was complete. The cafe was warm, the sun was bright, the coffee was good. And in her pocket the bell clinked. Author's note on Krampus. Krampus is a figure from Central European Alpine folklore, particularly associated with the regions of Austria, Bavaria, Slovenia, and northern Italy. In the traditional lore, Krampus is the dark companion of St. Nicholas who punishes wicked children on the night of December 5th, Krampusnacht, using birch switches Ruten to beat them and a sack to carry away the most wicked. The chains are a traditional element of Krampus iconography, representing the binding of the devil by the Christian Church. But in pre-Christian traditions, the chains likely represented something older, the binding of winter, the weight of judgment, the sound of something ancient being restrained. The creature's goat-like appearance draws from pre-Christian Alpine traditions, possibly connected to the horned god of Celtic and Germanic paganism. The concept of the hinterland in this story is a fictional elaboration on the folkloric idea of the wild hunt and the Alpine belief in a supernatural wilderness beyond the human world. The iron bells worn by the villagers are an original element of this story, but they draw on the widespread European folkloric tradition of iron as a protective metal against supernatural beings. The idea that Krampus has evolved from punishing children's naughtiness to judging adults' calculated sins is an original elaboration, but it reflects the deep moral framework of the original tradition, in which the Krampus figure represented the community's enforcement of ethical behavior, not merely obedience. The dragon spit. The gold isn't the prize, you idiot. The prize is the spit. Now hold the torch higher, or we'll be blind before we even find the entrance. Luke Varma heard these words as he pushed open the door of the tavern, and they stopped him in the way that a fragment of a conversation stops a man who knows that the words were not meant for him, but who also knows, with a sudden, sharp, instinctive certainty, that the words are about something that concerns him. He stood in the doorway of the Posada de la Vieja, a low-ceilinged, stone-walled tavern in the village of Cangas de Onís, in the Asturias region of northern Spain, and he listened to the two men at the back table. And the words settled into his brain the way a key settles into a lock, not because he understood them, but because they fit something that had been waiting, empty and ready, in the part of his brain that had been awake since 3 o'clock that morning, staring at the ceiling of his rented room, thinking about his daughter. Sophie was 9. She was in a hospital in London, in a room that smelled of disinfectant and the particular institutional sadness that permeates pediatric oncology wards, and she was dying. Not the way that people die in movies, slowly, gracefully, with meaningful conversations and a swelling soundtrack. She was dying the way that real people die, unevenly, unpredictably, in a decline that was sometimes steep and sometimes shallow, but always, always downward. And the decline was caused by a disease that Luke, a physician, a researcher, a man who had spent 20 years studying the mechanics of the human body, could not stop. The disease was called generalized hemolytic desquamation, and it was rare, so rare that Sophie was one of perhaps 40 documented cases in the world. And it was degenerative, and it was fatal, and it was accelerating, and the doctors at Great Ormond Street had told Luke, with the gentle, practiced, professionally calibrated sympathy of people who deliver bad news for a living, that there was nothing more they could do. They said this. They said there was nothing more they could do, and Luke had nodded and signed the forms and shaken their hands and walked out of the hospital and into the London rain and stood on the pavement and realized, with a clarity that was not intellectual but physical, a clarity that lived in his hands and his gut and the back of his throat, that nothing more was not acceptable. That nothing more was a phrase that applied to other people's children, not to his. That the doctors were not saying that nothing more could be done. They were saying that nothing more that they knew of could be done. That there was a difference. That the difference was the space between accepted medicine and everything else was vast, and most of it was useless, and some of it was criminal, and a small, terrifying fraction of it might work. Which was how Luke Varma, a disgraced physician, a man who had lost his medical license 3 years ago after a controversial experimental treatment he had administered to a dying patient, resulted in the patient's death and a hearing before the General Medical Council that stripped him of his right to practice, came to be standing in a tavern in Asturias, listening to two men talk about spit. He sat at the bar. He ordered a cider, the local cider, sharp and cloudy, and poured from a height that sent foam cascading over the rim of the glass. And he did not look at the two men at the back table, but he listened. He listened the way a physician listens to a heartbeat, not for the words but for the rhythm, the texture, the quality of the information that lay beneath the words, the diagnostic truth that the speaker's tone and cadence and emphasis revealed. The speaker was a large man, broad-shouldered, with a gray beard and hands that were scarred and weathered in the way that hands are scarred when they have spent decades gripping rope and stone, and the handles of tools that are designed for breaking things. His name, Luke would learn, was Garrick Shaw, and he was a recovery specialist, which was a euphemism for a mercenary who specialized in the retrieval of valuable objects from difficult locations, and the difficulty of the locations was usually a function of the danger. And the danger was usually a function of the fact that the objects were in places where the rule of law did not reach, and the rule of law did not reach because the places were either politically unstable, geographically inaccessible, or protected by something that the rule of law did not acknowledge. His companion was younger, leaner, more tense, a man named Daniel HSU who wore the compact, coiled physicality of someone who had been trained to hurt people, and who was always, at every moment, calculating the distance between his hands and the nearest threat. He was holding a flashlight, no, a torch, the British usage, and the torch was aimed at the table where a map was spread, and the map was old, hand-drawn, annotated in Spanish, and what looked like a language that Luke did not recognize, not Basque, not Galician, something older, something that used characters that looked like they had been pressed into the paper with a stylus rather than drawn with a pen. "The entrance is here," Garrick said, pointing at the map. "The locals call it La Boca, the mouth. It's a cave system that runs into the Picos de Europa, about 40 kilometers from here, up a track that hasn't been maintained since the 1950s. The cave was mapped in 1923 by a Spanish geologist named Orozco, who went in with a team of 4 and came out alone, and the notes he left describe a tunnel system that descends approximately 300 meters into the mountain and opens into a large cavern that he called the cathedral. And the gold, Daniel said. The gold is in the cathedral. According to Orozco's notes, the cavern is full of it, coins, ingots, artifacts. Asturian gold, Roman gold, Visigothic gold. The region has been mined for gold since before the Romans arrived, and the cave system was apparently used as a repository for centuries. The gold is there. I've confirmed it with 3 independent sources, one of whom is a 90-year-old shepherd who claims to have been inside the cave as a young man." "And you believe a shepherd?" "I believe the gold. I don't care about the shepherd." Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "And the spit." Garrick leaned back. He took a drink of his cider. He set the glass down. "The spit is the reason we're here," he said. "Not the gold. The gold pays for the expedition. The spit pays for the rest of our lives." "What is it?" "Saliva, solidified saliva. When the creature, the Cuelebre, sleeps, it drools. The saliva hardens on contact with the cave floor and the gold, and it forms these." He reached into his jacket and produced a small velvet pouch which he opened and tipped onto the table, and Luke from his seat at the bar could see what fell out. A stone. Small, perhaps the size of a walnut, irregularly shaped, translucent and luminous. It glowed, not with reflected light, with its own light, a faint, warm, amber gold radiance that pulsed slowly like a heartbeat, and the pulse was real. Luke could see it expanding and contracting, the light brightening and dimming, and the rhythm was approximately 1 pulse per second, which was the resting heart rate of a large mammal, and the stone was alive. The locals call them piedras de vida, Garrick said, stones of life. In the old legends, they're the reason the Cuelebre hoards gold. It doesn't care about the gold. It cares about the stones because the stones are its medicine. The creature is ancient, centuries old, maybe millennia, and the stones are what sustain it. They regenerate tissue. They reverse cellular decay. They cure disease. Luke's hands tightened on his glass. He did not move. He did not breathe. He sat at the bar with his cider and listened and watched the stone pulse on the table, and inside his chest, something that had been clenched and compressed and suffocating for months, the grief, the rage, the desperate, drowning helplessness of a father watching his daughter die, loosened by a fraction. Not hope, not yet, but the possibility of hope, which was worse, because the possibility of hope meant that there was something to lose again, and losing something was worse than never having it. "Where did you get that?" Daniel asked. "A dealer in Bilbao. He got it from a farmer who found it in a stream bed below the cave system. The farmer sold it for €500. The dealer sold it to me for 20,000, and the dealer told me something else. The stones can be activated. They're inert when they're separated from the creature, but if you apply them directly to a wound or a diseased area, and if you provide a catalyst, a source of biological energy, they transfer health. They heal." "What kind of catalyst?" "Blood, fresh blood. The stone absorbs the blood and converts it into regenerative energy. That's the price. That's the cost. You give blood, the stone gives health. The creature has been doing it for millennia, feeding on livestock, draining the blood, using the stones to sustain itself. It's not magic. It's biology. It's an organism that has evolved a symbiotic relationship with its own saliva, and the saliva is the most powerful regenerative agent on Earth." "How do you know it works?" Garrick looked at him. His gray eyes were steady and his scarred hands were still and his voice was flat. "Because I've seen it. 2 months ago in Bilbao, I watched a man with stage 4 liver cancer hold one of these stones against his chest for 30 seconds. 30 seconds, Daniel, and when he pulled it away, the tumor was gone, not reduced, not shrunk. Gone. The stone absorbed it, dissolved it, replaced it with healthy tissue. The man is alive, he is healthy, he is cured." "And the blood?" "The stone was covered in blood when he pulled it away. Not his. The dealer provided it. A rabbit's blood, a few milliliters, smeared on the stone's surface. That's all it took. A few milliliters of fresh blood and the stone cured a terminal cancer in 30 seconds. Silence. The tavern was quiet, just the three of them, the bartender having retreated to the kitchen, and the sound of rain on the stone walls, and the slow, steady pulse of the stone on the table. "We need a medical expert," Garrick said. "Someone who can verify the stone's potency in the field. Someone who can determine whether a stone is active or inert, how much blood is required, how to apply it. The creature won't let us walk in and take what we want. We need to know which stones are viable, and we need to know how to activate them, and we need someone who understands biology, someone who can think under pressure, someone who is desperate enough to go into a cave with a monster in it," Daniel said flatly. Garrick did not flinch. "Yes." Luke stood up. He picked up his cider and walked to the back table. He sat down, uninvited, and he looked at the stone on the table and he looked at Garrick and he said, "I'm a physician, or I was, and I need one of those stones." The team assembled over the following 3 days. Garrick was the leader and the financier. He had the map, the stone, and the contacts. Daniel HSU was the tactical operative, responsible for security, equipment, and the management of things that might need to be shot. 2 more men joined. Caspar Newman, a German mountaineer and cave diver who had spent 10 years exploring cave systems in the Alps and the Pyrenees, and who knew the geology of limestone caves with the intimacy of a man who had touched every wall of every tunnel he had ever entered, and Tomás Aguilar, a Spanish ex-military medic who had served in Afghanistan and who had, after his discharge, drifted into the world of private security and private recovery. and the gray, unregulated space between military and criminal that was the natural habitat of men with skills and no patience for bureaucracy. And Luke was the medical expert, the verification specialist, the man who would look at the stones and tell the team which ones were viable and which were inert. He had no combat training, no mountaineering experience, no particular physical courage. What he had was a body of knowledge, 20 years of medical practice and research, a deep understanding of cellular biology and regenerative medicine, and the experimental instinct that had cost him his license, but that had also, on 3 occasions before the fatal 4th, saved patients that conventional medicine had given up on. And what he had, beyond the knowledge, was the thing that made him suitable for an expedition into a monster's lair, a daughter who was dying, and a refusal to accept it. The expedition was funded by a syndicate, a consortium of private investors whom Garrick described only as people who understand the value of what we're looking for. The investors wanted the stones, all of them, and they were willing to pay Garrick's team a sum that would, if divided equally, give each man enough to retire. The gold was secondary, a bonus, a way to offset the costs of the expedition. The stones were the prize. The stones were the reason. Garrick briefed the team on the second night, in the back room of the tavern, with the stone on the table, and the map spread beside it, and the rain hammering the windows and the wind moaning through the gaps in the stone walls with a sound that was, Luke thought, uncomfortably like the sound of something breathing. The Cuelebre, Garrick said, is a creature from Asturian mythology. In the old stories, it's a dragon, a winged serpent that guards hoards of gold in caves in the mountains. It's old, it's big, it's dangerous. But the stories also say that the Cuelebre goes through a life cycle. It's born small and active, fast, aggressive, predatory. As it ages, it grows. It gets bigger, heavier, slower. By the time it reaches what the legends call its old age phase, it's enormous, massive, lethargic, almost completely inactive. It sleeps for decades at a time, waking only to feed. In its final phase, it molts, sheds its skin, its scales, everything, and the molt is violent. It shakes the earth. It collapses tunnels. It's the creature's last act before it dies. And we're going into the cave of one that's in its old age phase, Casper said. It was not a question. According to the intelligence I've gathered, yes. The cave system in the Picos has been quiet for decades. No reports of activity, no missing livestock, no sightings. The shepherd who entered the cave as a young man said the creature was there on the gold and it was sleeping. It was so large and so still that he thought it was a rock formation. He took a piece of gold and left, and the creature did not move. So it's dormant, Tomas said, or dead. The stones are active, Garrick said, holding up the glowing, pulsing walnut. This stone is alive. The creature that produced it is alive. If it were dead, the stone would be inert. The stone is not inert. The Cuelebre is alive and it is sleeping, and we are going to walk into its cave and take what we need. Luke looked at the stone. It pulsed. It glowed. It was warm. He could feel the heat radiating from it. A faint, organic warmth that was not the warmth of a mineral but the warmth of a living thing. The warmth of blood, of breath, of a heartbeat that was not his own but that he could feel in the marrow of his bones. The slow, ancient, geological patience of a creature that had been breathing in the dark of a mountain for longer than anyone in this room had been alive. He looked at the stone and he thought of Sophie and he said, "When do we leave?" "Tomorrow," Garrick said, "at dawn." The ascent began at 5 in the morning, in the dark, in the rain. The track that led from the road to the cave was not a track. It was a suggestion, a line of flattened grass and exposed rock that wound up the mountainside through pine forest and scree, and the low, clinging fog that the Asturians called orbiu. Not rain, not mist, but something in between. A fine, persistent, all-penetrating wetness that was not weather but atmosphere, that did not fall but existed, that coated every surface and soaked every fabric and turned the world into a gray, dripping, visibility-less enclosure that felt, to Luke, like the inside of a body. They walked for 6 hours. The track climbed steadily, switchbacking through the forest, then through a zone of scrub and bare rock where the trees gave way to heather and bilberry, and the occasional wind-twisted pine that looked like a hand reaching out of the ground. The rain intensified, then eased, then intensified again. The fog thickened. By the 10th kilometer, Luke could not see more than 20 feet in any direction, and the world had contracted to a sphere of wet, gray stone and wet, gray vegetation and the backs of his companions, moving ahead of him in a line. Garrick led. He was sure-footed, tireless, moving with the steady, metronomic pace of a man who has walked mountains his entire life, and who does not waste energy on speed or detours. Behind him was Casper, the cave diver, whose long, lean frame covered the ground with the effortless, loping stride of someone who is more comfortable underground than above it. Then Daniel, compact and tense, his eyes moving constantly, scanning the fog, the rocks, the trees, his hand never far from the sidearm that he carried in a holster under his jacket. Then Tamaz, the medic, whose broad, calm face showed nothing but the methodical, untroubled expression of a man who has been shot at and bombed, and who has learned that worry is a luxury that is best left at the bottom of the mountain. And Luke at the back struggling, his city dweller's legs burning, his lungs working hard in the thin air, his body protesting with every step. It was Luke who saw the first village, or what had been a village. They came upon it without warning. One moment they were walking through fog and rock, and the next they were standing in a cluster of stone buildings, low and small and old, with slate roofs and wooden doors and the small, square windows of mountain houses that were designed to keep the heat in and the cold out. There were 6 buildings, arranged around a common area that had once been a grassy square but was now a muddy, churned patch of earth, and the buildings were intact. The walls were standing, the roofs were sound, the doors were closed, and the village was empty. Not abandoned, not depopulated, not the slow, demographic death that had emptied hundreds of mountain villages across Spain as the young moved to the cities and the old died off. This was different. This was a village that had been lived in and then vacated, not gradually over years, but suddenly, completely, as though everyone who had been here had left on the same day, at the same moment, in the same direction. "The clothes," Casper said. He was standing in the doorway of one of the houses, and his voice was quiet, and the quietness was not calm. It was the quietness of a man who has seen something that he does not understand, and that his brain is refusing to process. Luke walked to him and looked inside. The house was a single room, stone walls, earthen floor, a fireplace, a table, 2 chairs, a bed. The bed was made. The table was set, 2 bowls, 2 spoons, a cup. The fireplace was cold, the ashes gray. And on the bed, on the chair, on the floor beside the door, clothes. Folded. Not thrown, not dropped, folded, neatly, precisely, as though the person who had been wearing them had taken them off with care and set them down with intention, and then had walked away wearing nothing. "They're everywhere," Daniel said. He was outside in the common area, and he was standing over a row of clothes, shirts, trousers, underclothes, boots, laid out in a neat, orderly line across the mud, as though a parade of people had undressed in sequence and walked away into the fog. "Every house," Tamaz said, emerging from another building. "Same thing, clothes on the bed, clothes on the floor, clothes on the chairs, folded, neat, like they were." "Evaporated," Luke said. The word came out before he had fully thought it through, but it was the right word, the precise word, the diagnostic word. He had seen something like this once before, in a medical journal, a case study of a disease that caused the rapid, complete loss of body mass, the tissue dissolving into the bloodstream and being carried away until nothing remained but the skeleton, and even the skeleton was. No, that was not the same. That was disease, this was something else. The clothes were folded, the people had folded them, they had taken off their clothes, folded them, and then. "What kind of disease does this?" Casper asked. No disease does this, Luke said. Disease does not dissolve people. Disease kills people and leaves bodies. These people. He looked at the folded clothes on the bed. He picked up a shirt. It was dry, clean, still warm from the iron or from the body that had been wearing it. These people were here and then they were not, and they took their clothes off first. Cuelebre, Garrick said. He was standing at the edge of the village looking up the mountain into the fog. His voice was flat, businesslike, the voice of a man who has accounted for every variable and has decided that this one, while unexpected, does not change the plan. The creature feeds. In its old age it's sluggish, but it still needs to eat. It comes down from the cave at night, finds livestock, finds. Livestock don't fold their clothes, Garrick. Garrick looked at him, the gray eyes were steady. No, he said, they don't. They found the livestock 20 minutes later, further up the track, in a small stone-walled pasture that was empty except for a dozen sets of bones, clean, white, completely stripped, arranged in neat rows on the grass as though the animals had lain down in order and been consumed where they lay. The bones were dry. The grass around them was green and healthy and untouched. There was no blood, no flesh, no offal, just the bones, white and perfect and hollow, and the grass, green and whole, and the fog and the silence. The creature doesn't eat flesh, Luke said, kneeling beside the bones. It drinks fluid, it drains them. The blood, the lymph, the cerebrospinal fluid, the synovial fluid, it takes everything liquid and leaves the dry. That's why the clothes are folded. The people took their clothes off because they felt heat. The creature generates heat, or it generates some kind of attractant, a chemical signal that causes the prey to. Stop, Daniel said. His voice was sharp. Stop analyzing. We're not here to study the creature. We're here to get the stones. Let's move. They moved. But Luke, walking at the back, looked at the bones and the folded clothes and the empty, clean, livable houses and the clinical part of his brain. The part that had been trained to observe and diagnose and theorize was working, and the theory it was producing was not comforting. The Cuelebre did not simply kill and eat. It harvested. It took the fluid, the essence, the liquid that animated the body, and it left the dry, the solid, the material. It was a predator, yes, but it was also a farmer, and the village was its pasture, and the people were its livestock, and the cave at the top of the mountain was its barn. And they were walking into it. They found the entrance at 4 in the afternoon, as the fog was thickening into dusk and the light was failing and the mountains were closing around them like the walls of a room. La Boca, the mouth, was aptly named. It was a cave opening in a limestone cliff face, perhaps 10 meters wide and 6 meters tall, and it was shaped like a mouth, not metaphorically, not in the vague, suggestive way that geologic formations sometimes resemble things, but precisely anatomically. The upper edge curved like a palate. The lower edge was flat like a jaw. And within the opening the rock was smooth, too smooth, polished, as though something large and heavy had been rubbing against it for centuries, entering and exiting, the friction of passage wearing the stone to a glassy, organic finish. The heat was the first wrong thing. Luke felt it before they reached the entrance. A warm, moist exhalation that came from within the cave. A breath. A slow, steady, geologically paced respiration that pushed warm, wet air out of the mouth and across their faces. And the air smelled of mineral and brine and something else. Something organic. Something that was not the smell of rock or water or earth, but the smell of a body. A large body. A living body. A body that had been breathing in the dark of this mountain for a very long time. "It's breathing," Caspar said, and his voice was not wonder but diagnosis, the assessment of a man who understood caves and who knew that caves do not breathe. "It's venting," Garrick said. "The cave system has a natural ventilation cycle. Warm air from the depths rises and exits through the mouth. It's normal. It's thermal convection." Caspar looked at him but said nothing. He knew, and Luke knew, and perhaps Garrick knew too, that thermal convection does not produce air that smells of brine and body, air that is warm and moist and rhythmic, air that comes in slow, even pulses that match the cadence of a heartbeat. But Garrick was the leader, and the leader had decided that the breathing was venting, and the decision was made, and they entered. The interior of the cave was vast. The entrance widened after the first 20 meters into a cathedral-like space, a natural limestone chamber with a ceiling that vanished into darkness above, and a floor that descended in a series of natural terraces, each one deeper and wider than the last. The walls were wet, covered in a film of moisture that caught the light of their headlamps and glittered, and the glitter was not white but gold, because the moisture was not water but something else, something thicker, something that clung to the rock and caught the light and reflected it in warm, amber tones, and Luke realized what it was: saliva. The walls were coated in saliva. The creature's drool had been running down the cave walls for decades, centuries, leaving a thin, glossy, organic film that hardened into a glaze, and the glaze was what made the walls smooth, what made them shine, what made them look like the inside of a mouth. Because they were inside a mouth. They were walking down the throat of a creature that was so large it had become the mountain. "Rax," Daniel said. He was ahead, his headlamp aimed at the floor, and the floor was not stone. It was covered in a layer of something, something white, something fine, something that crunched under their boots like dry snow. And when Luke looked down, he saw that it was scale. Scales. Thousands, millions of them, shed from the creature's body over centuries, accumulating on the cave floor in a thick, dry, shimmering carpet that was the color of bone and the texture of shale, and the scales were not uniform. They ranged in size from the dimensions of a fingernail to the dimensions of a dinner plate, and they were layered, the small ones on top, the large ones at the bottom, the geological record of a creature that had been growing and shedding in this cave for longer than the village below had existed. They descended. The cave system was not a single tunnel but a network, a branching, twisting, three-dimensional maze of passages that connected and diverged and reconnected in patterns that were, Casper said, not right. He was a cave diver. He understood cave geometry. He knew how limestone caves formed, how water dissolves rock along fault lines, creating passages that follow the structural weaknesses of the stone, branching and intersecting in predictable, geometrically regular patterns. These passages did not follow those patterns. They curved where they should have gone straight. They widened where they should have narrowed. They dead-ended where they should have continued, and the dead ends were not natural. They were smooth, polished, sealed with the same saliva glaze that covered the walls, as though something had deliberately closed the passages, blocking them, redirecting the flow of air and water and whatever else moved through the cave. "It's rerouting us," Casper said. His voice was tight, the voice of an expert whose expertise is being violated. "The passages have been altered. Something has been moving the rock, sealing the side tunnels, funneling us in a specific direction. We're not exploring the cave. We're being guided." "Guided where?" Garrick said. "Down, everything leads down. Every passage, every junction, every turn, it all descends. The creature is funneling us deeper." "Good," Garrick said. "The cathedral is at the bottom. The creature is pointing us to the gold." "Or pointing us to itself," Luke said. Garrick looked at him. The gray eyes were steady, untroubled, and Luke saw in them the same thing he had seen in Marcus Brennan's eyes in a different story on a different mountain: the absolute, deliberate, professional refusal to acknowledge a variable that does not change the plan. Garrick had decided what the plan was, and the plan was to reach the gold and the stones, and no amount of evidence, not the breathing cave, not the saliva walls, not the empty village, not the drained livestock, not the rerouted passages, was going to change the plan. Because changing the plan meant admitting that the plan might not work, and admitting that the plan might not work meant admitting that Sophie might die, and Luke understood this because he shared it, because the refusal was not rationality but survival, and without it, they would not be able to take another step. They continued down. The passages narrowed, then widened, then narrowed again, and the narrowing was worse each time. The walls pressing closer, the ceiling dropping lower, the floor rising to meet it, until they were crouching, then crawling, then slithering on their bellies through tunnels that were barely wider than their bodies. And the scale carpet was under their hands and their chests and their faces, and the scales were warm, body temperature, the residual heat of a creature that had been lying on them, and the saliva glaze on the walls was slick and viscous, and the smell of brine and mineral, and the organic body heat smell of the creature was thick and close and inescapable. Luke was not claustrophobic. He had never been claustrophobic, but the tunnels were doing something to him that had nothing to do with claustrophobia and everything to do with the knowledge, growing, deepening, becoming more certain with every meter of descent, that the cave was not a cave. The cave was a body. They were inside the body. The passages were not passages. They were arteries, veins, the circulatory system of an organism so large that it had become the geology, and the organism was not dead, not dormant, not sleeping in the way that sleeping things sleep. It was aware. It was aware of them the way a body is aware of a foreign object, a splinter, a parasite, a virus, and the awareness was not passive. It was responsive. The passages were adjusting around them, the walls shifting by millimeters, the floor rising and falling in slow, peristaltic waves that Luke could feel through his hands and his knees and his chest, the mountain swallowing them, drawing them deeper into its gut. And then the passage opened, and they were in the cathedral. The cavern was immense. Luke's headlamp could not reach the far walls or the ceiling. The beam dissipated in the darkness, swallowed by the scale of the space, and the only light was the faint, amber, pulsing glow that came from the floor below, from the gold because the floor was gold. Not covered in gold, not decorated with gold, the floor was gold. A solid, continuous layer of it, coins, ingots, bars, nuggets, dust, a geological stratum of precious metal that extended from wall to wall and filled the cavern to a depth that Luke could not estimate, because the depth was concealed by the sheer, overwhelming quantity of it. The gold piled and scattered and arranged in drifts and ridges and dunes that looked like a golden landscape with hills and valleys and plains, and the gold was not inert. The gold was warm. It radiated heat, not the heat of a metal but the heat of a body, the body temperature warmth that Luke had felt in the scales and the walls and the air, and the gold was the creature's bed. Because the creature was here. Luke saw it, and for a long, terrible moment, his brain could not process what his eyes were reporting. The far end of the cavern was filled with something that his visual cortex insisted was a rock formation, a massive, irregular, geological structure that rose from the gold floor to the ceiling, that was the color of shale and obsidian, that was textured and ridged and layered in ways that were consistent with metamorphic rock. It was enormous. It filled a quarter of the cavern. It was the size of a building, the size of a city block, and it was not a rock formation. It was the Cuelebre. The creature was in its old age phase, and the old age phase was not a phase. It was a state. The Cuelebre was so old, so large, so saturated with the gold and the saliva and the centuries of accumulated biological mass that it had become indistinguishable from the mountain. Its body was a mountain of scales, each one the size of a dinner plate, each one the color of dark slate and black glass, overlapping and interlocking in a pattern that looked like geological strata but was not, because the strata were moving. Slowly, barely perceptibly, the scales rose and fell with the breathing, those slow, geological, deep-time respirations that had been pushing warm air out of the cave mouth, and the breathing was visible now, the rise and fall of a chest that was the size of a cathedral, and each breath took approximately 90 seconds, and the breath was the heartbeat of the mountain. Its wings were folded. They were massive. Luke could see the edges of them, tucked against the body. The membranes stretched between finger bones that were the size of tree trunks, and the membranes were dark and taut and covered in a fine gold dust that clung to the surface like pollen. And the wings were the wings of a bat. Not a bird, not a dragon, a bat. the largest bat that had ever existed, and the bat was sleeping on a bed of gold. And the gold was its bed because the gold was warm and the creature was old and old things seek warmth. Its head was enormous. It was tucked against the body, the jaw resting on the gold, and the jaw was the size of a bus. The mouth was slightly open. The mouth was always slightly open because the creature drooled in its sleep, and the drool was the saliva, and the saliva was the source of the stones, and the stones were. Luke looked at the jaw, at the corner of the mouth, at the slow, thick, viscous stream of saliva that dripped from the corner of the jaw onto the gold, and where it hit, the gold hissed and the saliva hardened, and the hardened saliva was amber and translucent, and pulsing with the same warm, living light that he had seen in the stone in the tavern. The stones, they were everywhere, scattered across the gold like pebbles on a beach, dozens of them, hundreds, each one a small, glowing, pulsing testament to the creature's immortality, each one a cure for his daughter. "Oh my God," Tomas said. His voice was barely a whisper, and his face in the amber glow of the stones was the face of a man who has walked into a cathedral and found God, except that the God in this cathedral was a sleeping dragon the size of a building, and the cathedral was its body, and the man was an ant in the presence of something so vast and so old that the concept of presence was insufficient. The creature did not occupy the cavern. The creature was the cavern. The walls of the cavern were its body, the gold was its bed, the air was its breath, and the 5 men standing at the edge of the gold field were mites on the skin of a god. "How do we know it's asleep?" Daniel said. His voice was quiet, controlled, the voice of a professional, but his hand was on his sidearm, and the sidearm was an absurdity, a human weapon, a tool of human violence, in the presence of a creature whose scales were so thick that a bullet would not reach the flesh beneath them, a creature whose body was a geological formation, a creature that could not be shot because shooting it would be like shooting a mountain. "The breathing," Garrick said, "the breathing is slow and regular. In its active phase, the breathing is fast, shallow, rapid, like a predator's. This is deep sleep. This is the deepest phase of its life cycle. It won't wake." "You don't know that." "I know the stones are active. The stones only pulse when the creature is in deep sleep. In active phase, the stones go inert. The creature reabsorbs them. The fact that they're pulsing means the creature is deeply asleep. It won't wake. Let's move." They moved. They descended onto the gold field, and the gold shifted and clinked under their boots, and the sound was loud, obscenely, terrifyingly loud in the silence of the cavern, the clatter of metal on metal echoing off the walls, and Luke winced with every step, and the creature breathed, and the breathing did not change. The slow 90-second cycle continued, and the scales rose and fell, and the amber stones pulsed, and the 5 men crossed the gold field toward the jaw, toward the stones, toward the cure. The gold was not just gold. As they walked, Luke's headlamp caught other things among the coins and the ingots, bones. White, clean, dry bones scattered through the gold like shells on a beach, and the bones were not livestock bones. They were human. He could see the skulls, small, adult, the cranial vaults intact, the orbits empty, the jaws closed, and the skulls were arranged in a pattern that was not random. They were placed at regular intervals across the gold field like signposts, like markers, and Luke understood. The creature did not hoard gold. It hoarded things. It hoarded gold and bones and stones, and the hoard was not a treasure. It was a collection. It was the collected evidence of a predator's life, and the bones were the evidence of meals, and the gold was the evidence of commerce, and the stones were the evidence of the creature's own body's work, and the collection was not for display. It was for comfort. The creature slept on its collection, the way a dog sleeps on its bed, surrounded by the familiar smells of its kills, and the gold was warm because the creature was warm, and the bones were clean because the creature had drained them, and the stones were glowing because the creature was dreaming, and the dream was the same dream it had been dreaming for centuries. The dream of Mar Cuejada, the paradise it sought, the warm, saltwater place where it would molt and die and be born again. Luke reached the jaw. The corner of the mouth was 6 feet above him. The creature's head was so large that its jaw was at the height of a man, and the saliva was dripping from the corner, a slow, thick, viscous stream that hardened on the gold below, and the hardened stones were within reach. He could pick one up. He could hold it. He could. "Don't touch it yet," Garrick said. He was beside Luke and his voice was tense. The first tension Luke had heard in it, the first crack in the professional calm. "We need to collect as many as we can. Fill the bags, all of them. We don't come back." The team dispersed across the gold field, each man carrying a reinforced canvas bag, and they began to collect the stones. Luke picked one up, and the moment his fingers closed around it, he felt it. A pulse, a heartbeat, a warmth that traveled through his hand and up his arm and into his chest, and for a moment, a single, dizzying, devastating moment, he felt well. Not healed, not cured, but well, in the way that you feel well when a fever breaks, when the pain recedes, when the body remembers what it is like to be whole. And the stone in his hand was doing this, was giving him this, was transferring something. Not health, but the template of health. The pattern of a body that had been alive for centuries, that had never been sick, that had never known decay. And the pattern was entering his cells through his skin. And his cells were responding, and the feeling was. The feeling was the most dangerous thing in the cave, because the feeling was addictive. The stone made you well, and being well was the most powerful, most irresistible, most corrupting sensation a human being could experience, and Luke understood in that moment why the creature hoarded the stones, why it slept on them, why it guarded them. Not because they were medicine, but because they were pleasure, and pleasure was the one thing that no creature, no matter how old, no matter how vast, could resist. He put the stone in his bag. He picked up another, and another. The stones were everywhere scattered across the gold, nested in the creases of the creature's jaw, embedded in the saliva glaze on the walls, and the team collected them with the focused, silent efficiency of professionals. And the bags grew heavier, and the creature breathed, and the stones pulsed, and the cavern was warm and amber and still. And then Tamaz touched the jaw. It was an accident, or it looked like an accident. Tamaz was reaching for a stone that was lodged in the corner of the creature's mouth, a stone that was still wet, still forming, still connected to the saliva stream by a thin, amber thread, and he reached too far, and his hand touched the creature's lip, and the lip was. The lip moved. Not a twitch, not a spasm. A slow, deliberate, muscular contraction, the lip drawing back, the jaw opening wider, and the teeth were visible. They were the size of swords, rows of them, hundreds of them, black and curved and slick with saliva, and they were not human teeth or animal teeth. They were something older, something that belonged to a creature that had evolved before the dinosaurs, before the mammals, before the concept of teeth had been refined by evolution into the standardized models that the animal kingdom used. These teeth were primitive and they were functional, and their function was not chewing. Their function was holding. The Cuelebre did not chew its prey. It held it in its jaws in the cage of those black, sword-sized teeth, and it drained it slowly, the way a spider drains a fly, and the teeth were designed to hold, to grip, to prevent escape, and the jaw was opening, and Tamaz's hand was inside. "Tamaz!" Daniel shouted, and Tamaz yanked his hand back and stumbled, and the jaw closed, not fast, not with the speed of a predator, but with the weight of a geological event, the upper and lower jaws coming together with a sound that was not a snap but a boom, a deep, resonant, subsonic impact that Luke felt in his chest and his teeth and the floor of the cavern, and the gold shook, and the stones rattled, and the boom echoed through the cavern and through the passages and through the mountain, and the silence that followed was not silence. It was a heartbeat, the creature's heartbeat. It had changed. The slow, 90-second deep sleep rhythm was gone, and the new rhythm was faster, stronger, a heavy, pounding, accelerating pulse that Luke could feel through the gold floor, through his boots, through his bones, and the pulse was the sound of a heart waking up, a heart that had been beating once every 90 seconds for decades, for centuries, and that was now beating once every 5 seconds. And the rate was increasing, and the gold was vibrating, and the scales on the creature's body were shifting. Not the slow, peristaltic movement of breathing, but a rapid, muscular adjustment, the body reconfiguring itself, drawing in its limbs, tensing its wings and the eyes. Luke had not seen the eyes, had not wanted to see the eyes, but now the eyes were open. They were yellow. Not amber, not gold, yellow, the yellow of sulfur, the yellow of aged bone, the yellow of something that has been in the dark for so long that the color has been leached from everything except the eyes. And the eyes were open, and they were looking at them, and the looking was not the looking of an animal. It was the looking of a mountain. It was the looking of a geological formation that has become aware of the ants on its surface, and that is deciding, with the slow, massive, tectonic patience of something that has been alive since before the mountains existed, what to do about them. "Run," Garrick said. His voice was calm, too calm, the calm of a man who has accepted the consequences. "Run now." But the Cuelebre did not let them run. The first thing it did was open its wings. The wings that had been folded against its body, the wings that were the size of sails, the wings that had been tucked away for decades in the sleep of old age. The Cuelebre opened them and the cavern changed. The wings did not unfold. They expanded, the membrane stretching, the finger bones extending, and the wingspan was the width of the cavern, and the creature brought them down. Not to fly, to move air. The wing stroke was a single, massive downward thrust, and the air moved. Not a breeze, not a wind, but a shockwave. A displacement of atmosphere that picked up the gold coins and the dust and the small stones and hurled them across the cavern like shrapnel. And the 5 men were thrown, not thrown, launched. Picked up by the air and carried backward, tumbling, crashing into the gold and the bones and the walls. And Luke hit the far wall of the cavern with his back and his head, and the impact drove the breath from his lungs and the vision from his eyes. And for a moment he was blind and breathless and weightless in a storm of flying gold. Then the second wing stroke came, and the third, and the creature was not flying, it was pumping, using its wings to create a current, a flow, a directed stream of air that moved through the cavern like a river, and the river was pulling them. Not pushing, pulling. The air was being drawn toward the creature, toward the open mouth, and the gold and the dust and the stones and the men were being pulled toward the jaws, and Luke dug his hands into the gold and the scales and the bone beneath him, and he held on, and the air screamed past him, and the pull was immense, a vacuum, a negative pressure that was not wind but force, the creature using its wings to create a pressure differential, to suck the air out of the cavern and draw everything in it toward its mouth. The bags of stones were ripped from the men's hands. The heavy, reinforced canvas bags, full of glowing, pulsing stones, were lifted by the current and drawn toward the creature. And the creature opened its mouth wider, and the bags sailed in, and the jaws closed, and the creature swallowed its own stones, reabsorbing them, reclaiming them, and the amber glow in the cavern dimmed as the stones were consumed. "Shoot it," Daniel screamed, and he drew his sidearm, a .45, a heavy, hard-hitting handgun that could stop a man at 50 meters, and he fired. 4 shots, rapid, aimed at the creature's head, and the bullets struck the scales and bounced. They did not penetrate. They did not crack. They hit the obsidian-hard surface and ricocheted with a high, sharp, metallic ping that was almost comical in its inadequacy, the sound of a fly landing on a tank, and the creature did not flinch. It did not blink. It did not notice. "It's no use," Casper shouted. "The scales are—" He did not finish. The creature's tail moved. The tail, which had been curled behind the body, invisible in the darkness, a thick, muscular, scaled appendage that was the length of a train carriage, swept across the cavern floor with a single, lateral stroke, and the gold erupted, and the bones flew, and the tail hit Daniel. It did not crush him. It caught him. A glancing blow, a tap, by the creature's standards, and Daniel was knocked off his feet and sent skidding across the gold field, his gun flying from his hand, and he fetched up against a ridge of gold ingots and lay still. "Get to the passages," Garrick shouted. He was on his feet running not toward the entrance but toward the side of the cavern where the passages, the rerouted, creature-designed passages that led down, always down, opened in the walls. The side passages. Go now. They ran. Luke ran. He ran with every ounce of speed and desperation that his city-dweller's body could produce, and his legs burned and his lungs burned and his back burned where he had hit the wall, and behind him the creature was moving. Not chasing, not in the way that a predator chases prey. The Cuelebre was too large to chase. It was too large to pursue. It was too large to fit through the passages, but it was not too large to reach. The creature's wing stroke changed direction. Instead of pulling air in, it pushed air out. A single, directed, focused blast of air that was aimed not at the cavern but at the passage openings, and the air hit the passages like a hammer, and the passages amplified the blast, the narrow tunnels acting as waveguides, and the air accelerated. And the blast that reached the passages was not wind, but a wall of pressure that picked up Luke and threw him forward. Not into the passage but through it, tumbling, rolling, the stone walls spinning past him, the scales and the saliva and the gold dust filling his mouth and his eyes and his nose, and he was being herded. That was the word, herded. The creature was using its wings to create pressure differentials that moved the men through the passages like cattle through a chute, directing them, funneling them, pushing them deeper into the cave system, into the narrower, darker, more constricted tunnels where the creature could not follow but where the men could not escape. And in the tunnels the creature had other tools. The walls moved. The saliva-glazed surfaces shifted, not by inches but by feet, the passages narrowing in real time, the stone flowing like warm metal, the geometry of the cave system reconfiguring around them, and Luke realized that the rock of the cave walls was not rock. It was the creature's body. The passages were not tunnels through stone. They were arteries through flesh, and the flesh was the Cuelebre's, and the Cuelebre was squeezing them, compressing the passages, drawing them deeper, herding them toward. Toward what? What was at the bottom of the cave? What was the creature funneling them toward? Luke did not know. He did not want to know. He ran because running was the only option, and the passage ahead was dark and narrow and wet and descending, and the air behind him was still, and the silence was returning, and the silence was worse than the wind, because the silence meant the creature had stopped pushing, and if it had stopped pushing, it had started something else. He found Daniel in the passage. The tactical operative was on his back, his eyes open, his face bloody, his sidearm gone. His left arm was bent at an angle that arms are not designed to bend, and his breathing was shallow and rapid, and when Luke knelt beside him, Daniel looked up at him and said through bloody teeth, "Get the stones." "What?" "The stones, in my bag. The bag is—" He looked around. The bag was gone. The air blast had taken it, or the creature had taken it, or it was lost somewhere in the gold field, and Daniel's face, in the dim light of Luke's headlamp, showed something that Luke had not expected to see. Not fear, but grief. The grief of a man who has lost the one thing that mattered. "I have one," Luke said. He reached into his jacket. The stone, the first one he had picked up, the one that had made him feel well, was still in his inner pocket, secured by the zipper that he had closed without thinking, the reflex of a man who protects valuable things. He pulled it out and it pulsed in his hand, and the amber glow lit Daniel's face, and Daniel looked at it and then at Luke and said, "Go get out the passages, Casper knows them. Follow Casper, get the stone out, get it to—" He stopped, he coughed, blood came, "Get it to whoever needs it." "My daughter," Luke said. "Yeah," Daniel said. "Your daughter, go." "I can't, my arm, I'll slow you down, go." "I can help you." "Go." Daniel's voice was not a request. It was an order, the order of a man who has spent his career giving orders in bad situations and who knows, with the cold, professional clarity of someone who has calculated the odds, that his odds are 0 and Luke's are not. "Go now, before it comes." Luke looked at him. He looked at the passage ahead, dark and descending. He looked at the stone in his hand, pulsing, warm, alive. He looked at Daniel, lying on the stone floor of a cave in the mountains of Asturias, his arm broken, his face bloody, his odds 0. He went. The passages were a labyrinth. Luke ran through them, his headlamp bouncing, the walls close and wet and moving. Not fast, not dramatically, but perceptibly, the stone flowing inward by millimeters with every step he took. The tunnels narrowing, the ceiling dropping, the floor rising, the creature's body closing around him like a fist. He could hear it, distant, muffled, but audible. The beat of the wings, the rhythmic, percussive thump-thump-thump of the Cuelebre's wings striking the air in the cavern, each stroke sending a pulse of pressure through the passages, each pulse pushing him deeper. He ran. He ran until the passage ended, not at a wall but at a drop. A vertical shaft, narrow, descending into darkness, and Luke shone his headlamp down it and saw nothing, just the beam falling into a depth that swallowed it, and the air that came up from the shaft was warm and wet and smelled of brine and the mineral, body heat smell of the creature, and Luke understood. This was the throat. The passage he was in was a tributary, and the shaft was the main artery, the central passage that led down to whatever was at the bottom of the cave system, and the creature was pushing him toward it. He turned around. He would go back. He would find another passage, another route, a way out that did not go through the creature's gut. He turned, and the passage behind him was closed. Not narrowed, closed. The walls had come together, the stone flowing like warm wax, the saliva glaze sealing the gap, and the passage was gone, and Luke was standing on the edge of a vertical shaft with no way back and no way forward but down. "Casper," he shouted, "Garrick, Tamaz, anyone." His voice echoed. The echo was wrong, not the sharp, clean echo of a stone tunnel but the soft, muffled, organic echo of a living space, the echo you hear when you shout into a body, and the echo said, "You are inside something, and the something is alive, and the something is aware of you, and the something is waiting." The shaft was the only way. Luke took a breath. He gripped the stone in his pocket, the stone that was supposed to save his daughter's life, the stone that was the reason he was here, the reason he had left her bedside and flown to Spain and walked into a mountain, and was now standing at the edge of a creature's throat with no way out but down, and he climbed into the shaft and descended. The shaft descended for what Luke estimated was 40 meters, though time and distance had lost their meaning in the dark, in the warm, wet, breathing dark of the Cuelebre's body. The walls of the shaft were slick with the saliva glaze, and the glaze was warm and slightly adhesive, and Luke's hands found purchase in the ridges of the walls, the ridges that were not geological features but the creature's muscular structure, the bands of tissue that ran along the interior of the passage like the ribs of a snake, and the ribs were moving, contracting and expanding in slow, peristaltic waves that Luke could feel through his hands and his feet, the mountain swallowing him, drawing him down. He reached the bottom. The shaft opened into a space, not a cavern, not a passage, but a crevice, a narrow, vertical crack in the rock that ran horizontally for perhaps 100 meters, the width varying from 2 meters to half a meter, the ceiling and the floor pressing close, and the space was filled with something that Luke's headlamp illuminated with a sick, amber clarity. Bones. Human bones. Dozens of skeletons packed into the crevice, not scattered but arranged, stacked, ordered, the long bones parallel, the skulls facing the same direction, and the arrangement was not random. It was organized. It was the organization of a larder. This was the creature's pantry. The crevice was where it stored its kills, not the fluid which had been consumed, but the dry remains, the bones, the husks, the empty containers that had once been people, and the people had been placed here in this narrow, warm, dark space at the bottom of the cave. And the creature had sealed it, and the bones had been here for decades, centuries, and Luke was standing among them, and the bones were looking at him with their empty orbits, and the silence was the silence of the dead, which is the deepest and most final silence of all. He moved through the crevice. He had to, there was no other way. The shaft had deposited him here, and the crevice was the only passage, and he moved laterally, sideways, his back against one wall and his chest against the other, his feet shuffling through the bones, and the bones rattled and clinked under his boots, and the sound was obscenely loud in the enclosed space, and the bones were dry and light and hollow. And some of them crumbled when he stepped on them, and the crumbling was not the sound of old calcium, but the sound of something that had been completely, totally, absolutely drained, not of fluids but of substance. The calcium itself leached away, the bones reduced to a chalky, fragile shell that barely held its shape. Cuelebre did not just take the liquid, it took the mineral. It took the calcium, the iron, the zinc, the copper, the elemental material of the body, the building blocks of the bones and the blood and the cells, and it absorbed them through its saliva, through the glaze that coated the walls, through the scales that lined the passages, and the absorption was what made the creature grow, what made it massive, what made it the mountain, and the bones in the crevice were the evidence, the receipts, the record of centuries of feeding. Luke reached the end of the crevice. It opened into a wider space, a junction where several passages met, and the junction was circular, perhaps 10 meters in diameter, with passages leading off in 5 directions like the spokes of a wheel. The floor of the junction was smooth, worn smooth, polished, the same glassy finish as the cave mouth, and in the center of the floor there was a hole. A circular hole, perhaps a meter in diameter, perfectly smooth, perfectly round, and from the hole, a faint amber light rose, the light of the stones, and the light was warm and pulsing, and Luke could feel the heat from the hole on his face, and the heat was not the heat of the creature's body. It was the heat of the stones themselves, concentrated, amplified, and the hole was. The hole was a well, a shaft that descended further into a space that was below even this, the deepest part of the cave, and the amber light came from below, and Luke leaned over the edge and looked down and saw. Stones, hundreds of them, thousands. A cavern below, smaller than the cathedral above but filled with stones, not scattered but piled, heaped. A mound of glowing, pulsing amber stones that filled the space the way the gold filled the cathedral, and the stones were the creature's heart. Not its anatomical heart, its pharmacological heart, its medicine chest, its store of regenerative material, and the creature had been accumulating them for centuries, and they were here at the bottom of the cave in a space that was warmer and more humid and more alive than anywhere else in the system, and Luke understood. This was the creature's vault. The cathedral above was the bedroom. The pantry behind him was the larder. And this, the well, the vault, the mound of glowing stones, was the treasury. And the creature was above him, between him and the exit, in the cathedral, in the passages, in the walls, in the stone, in the air. He was below the creature. He was behind it, beneath it, inside it, and the only way out was through it. He heard Casper before he saw him. A voice, distant, echoing through one of the 5 passages that led off from the junction, thin, strained, the voice of a man who has been yelling for a long time and who has been yelling into stone that absorbs sound the way a sponge absorbs water. Luke followed the voice. He entered the passage, narrow, descending slightly, the walls close, and after 20 meters he found Casper. The cave diver was sitting on the floor of the passage, his back against the wall, his legs stretched out, and his headlamp was off, dead, the battery exhausted, and in the darkness of Luke's approaching lamp, his face was white and drawn and old. His left leg was wrong, not broken but trapped, the ankle wedged between 2 sections of the passage wall that had closed on it, the stone flowing inward and gripping his foot like a hand, and the grip was tight, and the stone was still moving, millimeter by millimeter, the passage narrowing, and Casper's lower leg was blue below the grip, the circulation cut off, and he had been here, Luke estimated, for at least an hour. "It's been doing it slowly," Casper said. His voice was calm, the calm of a man who has spent 10 years in caves and who understands that panic is a luxury he cannot afford. "It closed on my ankle about 100 meters back, and I managed to pull myself along, dragging the wall until the passage opened up here. But the grip is getting tighter. I think," he paused. He looked at his foot. I think it's going to take the foot. I can, Luke began. No, Casper said. You can't. The stone is the creature's body. You can't cut through it. You can't pry it apart. I've been trying for an hour. It's alive, Luke. The stone is alive. When I push against it, it pushes back. When I pull, it tightens. He stopped. He breathed. He looked at Luke, and his face in the headlamp was the face of a man who has made a calculation and has accepted the result. It's testing me, I think, the way a cat tests a mouse, not to kill it, to see what it does, to see how it moves, how it reacts, how it struggles. It's learning me, Luke. It's learning all of us. The passages, the wind, the narrowing, I think it's been studying us since we entered, figuring out how we move, how we think, where we go when we're cornered. And now it's practicing on me. Can you get your boot off? The boot is the only thing between my foot and the stone. If I take it off, the stone will be on my skin, and then he did not finish. He did not need to. The saliva glaze on the stone was the creature's absorption mechanism. If it touched bare skin, it would begin to draw the fluid, the mineral, the substance, the same process that had emptied the village and the livestock and the people whose bones were in the crevice behind Luke. The boot was a barrier. The boot was the only barrier. I have a stone, Luke said. He pulled it from his pocket. The amber glow lit the passage, and Casper looked at it, and his face changed. Not hope, but something adjacent, something that Luke recognized because he had felt it himself. The realization that the thing that could save you exists and is close and is in the hands of someone else, and that your survival depends on the decisions of another person. That's a healing stone, Casper said. It can regenerate tissue. If I put it on your ankle, if you put it on my ankle, it will heal the tissue that the stone is crushing. And then the creature's stone will crush the healed tissue. And then the healing stone will heal it again. And the cycle will continue until the healing stone is exhausted, and my ankle will be a battleground between two biological forces, and I will be the casualty. Luke stared at him. How do you know that? Because I've been watching the stone on the wall. There's a small one embedded in the wall about 2 meters up. I've been watching it for an hour. When the wall tightens on my ankle, the stone on the wall brightens. It pulses faster. It's feeding. It's feeding on the damage. The creature's stones are the opposite of the healing stones. They consume instead of give. The healing stones and the consuming stones are the same stones, Luke. They're the same material. The healing and the consuming are two sides of the same coin. The stone heals by absorbing. It absorbs the disease, the damage, the decay, and it converts it into energy. But the energy has to come from somewhere. The stone is not creating health from nothing. It is transferring it from the disease to the stone, from the stone to the patient. The creature's stones absorb health from the prey and transfer it to the creature. Your healing stone absorbs health from a blood sacrifice and transfers it to the patient. It's the same process, the same mechanism, the same biology. Luke felt the stone in his hand pulse, warm, alive, and he understood, not in the abstract, not as a theory, but in the concrete, specific, personal way that a father understands the cost of saving his child, that the stone was not a cure. It was a transfer. It moved health from one body to another, and the body that gave the health lost it, and the body that received the health gained it, and the Cuelebre was not a monster. It was a farmer. It farmed health. It farmed life. It farmed the icky, the spark, the vital force, and it had been farming it for centuries, taking it from the villagers, from the livestock, from anyone who came close enough to be absorbed. And the stones were the crop, and the gold was the fertilizer, and the cave was the farm, and the creature was the farmer. And Luke was about to become a crop. Go, Casper said. There's a passage, third one from the left in the junction. It ascends. I felt the air current when I first came through. It goes up. It might go all the way to the surface. It might be the way out. I'm not leaving you. You are, because if you stay, we both die. And you have the stone. And the stone is the point. The stone is the reason. Go, Luke. Go now before the creature finishes its experiment and comes for the rest of us. Luke looked at Casper. The cave diver's face was set, composed, the face of a man who has spent his life in dark places and who has decided that this dark place will be his last. He was not afraid. Or rather, he was afraid in the way that all men are afraid, but the fear was not on his face, because he had put it somewhere else, somewhere deep, somewhere that the creature's stones could not reach, and the composure was not courage but discipline, the discipline of a man who has decided that his death will not be a spectacle. "Tell my wife," Casper said. "If you make it out, her name is Elk, she's in Munich, tell her." He stopped. He smiled. It was a small, tight, painful smile, and it was the saddest thing Luke had ever seen. "Tell her I found the cave. Tell her it was beautiful." Luke took his hand. He gripped it hard, the grip of a man saying goodbye to a man he has known for 3 days and will remember for the rest of his life. Then he turned and went back to the junction, and he entered the third passage from the left, and the passage ascended, and Casper's voice did not follow him, and the silence of the cave closed behind him like water. The passage ascended. It was narrower than the others, a crack in the rock that Luke had to traverse sideways, his chest against one wall and his back against the other, the stone scraping his jacket and his skin, and the stone was warm and slick with the glaze, and the glaze was the creature's skin, and Luke was moving through the creature's body the way a pill moves through a digestive tract, slowly, painfully, the walls pressing, the air thinning, the darkness absolute. He found Tamaz in the passage, or what was left of Tamaz. The medic was on the floor on his back, and his body was wrong. Not broken, wrong. The fabric of his clothes was intact, but the body beneath was diminished, reduced, the flesh and the muscle and the fat drawn away, the skin pulled tight against the bones, and the bones were visible, not through wounds but through the skin itself, which had become translucent, papery, a membrane stretched over a frame that was no longer fully solid, and the frame was dissolving. The calcium was leaving. The mineral was being drawn out, absorbed through the saliva glaze on the walls, through the stone that pressed against his body, and Tamaz was being consumed. Not eaten but absorbed, his body slowly, gently, almost peacefully dissolving into the cave, into the creature, into the mountain. He was still alive. His eyes were open. They were clear and calm and focused, and when Luke knelt beside him, Tamaz looked up at him and said, in a voice that was thin and reedy and already half gone, "It doesn't hurt. It's like falling asleep. The warmth, the stone is warm, and the warmth pulls you, and you want to go toward it, and going toward it is." Tamaz, "It's peaceful, Luke. It's the most peaceful thing I've ever felt. That's the trap. That's how it gets you. Not with teeth, not with force, with comfort, with warmth, with the feeling that everything will be fine if you just let go." His eyes closed. His chest stopped moving. The translucency of his skin deepened, and Luke could see through it, through the tissue, through the muscle, through the vanishing bone, and in 30 seconds Tamaz was gone. Not a body, not bones, not a trace, just the clothes, folded neatly on the stone floor, and a faint, amber stain on the rock where the body had been, and the stain was already being absorbed, drawn into the stone, into the creature, into the mountain. Luke stood up. He did not look back. He moved forward through the passage, through the creature's body, and the passage ascended, and the air grew cooler. Not warm, not hot, but cool, and the coolness was the first sign of the surface, the first hint of the outside, and Luke moved faster, and the passage widened, and the walls separated, and the ceiling rose, and the air. The air tasted like pine, like snow, like mineral and water, and the thin, clean, electrically innocent air of the mountain at altitude, and Luke was climbing now, scrambling, the passage tilting upward at a steep angle, the stone rougher, less glazed, less alive, the creature's body thinning here, the outer reaches of its flesh, the edge of its domain, and the light. Not the amber light of the stones, daylight. Gray, dim, filtered through fog and rain, but daylight. Real daylight, the light of the sun, the light of the world outside the mountain, and Luke clawed toward it, his hands tearing on the rough stone, his knees bleeding, his breath coming in great, ragged, sobbing gasps, and the passage widened and became a crack, and the crack became a gap, and the gap became an opening, and Luke fell out of the mountain, and onto the scree and the rain and the cold and the gray, infinite, beautiful, empty sky. He was out. He was outside. The mountain was behind him, the cave mouth, La Boca, was somewhere above and behind, and the rain was falling and the fog was thick, and the air was cold and clean and did not smell of brine or mineral, or the warm, organic body heat of a creature that had been alive since before the concept of humans existed. He was out. And he had the stone. He pulled it from his pocket. It was still there, still warm, still pulsing, still alive, and in the gray daylight the amber glow was faint but present, and Luke held it in his bleeding hand and looked at it, and the stone pulsed, and the pulse was the heartbeat of the mountain, the heartbeat of the creature. The heartbeat of something ancient and patient and vast, and the stone was in his hand, and the creature was in the mountain, and his daughter was in a hospital in London, and the stone could save her, and the cost was blood, and Luke had blood, and the transaction was clear. He stood up. He began to walk, down the mountain, through the fog, through the rain, through the orbiu that was not rain and not mist but existence, and the mountain was behind him, and the stone was in his pocket, and his daughter was ahead. But the mountain was not done with him. He felt it before he heard it, a vibration in the ground, a tremor that started in the soles of his feet and climbed through his legs and into his spine, and the tremor was not an earthquake. It was rhythmic. It was a heartbeat. The creature's heartbeat, the massive geological 90-second pulse that he had felt in the cavern, but faster now, much faster, 1 beat per second, and the rate was increasing, and the ground was shaking, and the scree was sliding, and the fog around him was thickening, and Luke realized what was happening. The Cuelebre was molting. Garrick had described it, the final phase of the creature's life cycle, the shedding of the skin, the scales, everything. The violent, earth-shaking process that collapsed tunnels and shook the mountain. The creature was old, centuries old, and the old age phase was ending, and the next phase was the molt, and the molt was the creature's death throes, and the death throes were violent, and the mountain was coming apart. The ground split. A fissure opened in the scree, 10 meters to Luke's left, and from the fissure a blast of hot, wet, sulphurous air erupted, and the air smelled of the cave, of brine and mineral and the body heat of the creature. And the fissure was the mountain opening, the creature's body cracking, the skin splitting. And Luke could hear it, a deep, subsonic, tectonic groan that was not a roar and not a scream, but the sound of a mountain-sized organism shedding its skin. And the sound was the most terrifying thing he had ever heard, not because of its volume or its violence, but because of its grief. It was the sound of something dying, something ancient, something that had been alive for so long that its life was indistinguishable from the geology, and the dying was not just a biological event but a geological one, and the mountain was grieving, and the grief was in the ground and the air and the fog and the rain and the stone in Luke's pocket, which was pulsing wildly. Its calm, 1-second rhythm shattered into a rapid, frantic, erratic stutter that was the heartbeat of a dying thing. Luke ran. He ran down the mountain, through the scree, through the sliding rocks, through the fissures that were opening around him like cracks in a breaking shell, and the ground shook and the air blasted, and the fog was filled with something, particles, fragments, pieces of scale and skin that were being shed from the creature's body and hurled into the air. And the particles were hot and organic, and they landed on Luke's skin and burned, not with heat but with absorption. The saliva glaze still active, the consuming process still functioning, and Luke brushed them off and ran, and the mountain behind him was dissolving, the creature's body coming apart, the stone and the scale and the saliva and the gold all mixed together in a chaotic, violent, earth-shaking eruption of biological material that was not death but transformation, because the Cuelebre did not die. It molted, it shed the old body and grew a new one, and the new one was, where? Where did the new body go? In the cave, the stones, the vault at the bottom of the cave, the mound of glowing, pulsing amber stones. They were not medicine. They were not the creature's pharmacy. They were the creature's seeds. The stones were the next generation, the new bodies, the embryos of new Cuelebres, and the molt was the process of releasing them, of scattering them, of planting them in the world where they would grow and age and molt and plant their own seeds, and the cycle was eternal, and Luke was holding one. The stone in his pocket was not a cure, it was an egg. And Luke ran. He ran and did not stop, and the mountain shook behind him, and the fog swallowed the sound, and the rain swallowed the dust, and the mountain settled, slowly, grudgingly, the tremors fading, the fissures closing, the creature's old body collapsing into the cave, into the mountain, into the earth, and the cave mouth, la boca, sealed. The rocks fell, the stone flowed, the saliva glaze hardened, and the entrance was gone, closed forever, the mountain swallowing its own dead the way it swallowed everything, and the Cuelebre was gone, and the gold was gone, and the bones were gone, and the men were gone, Daniel, Caspar, Tamaz, Garrick, all of them, sealed in the mountain with the creature's molted remains. And Luke was alone, running down the mountain in the rain, holding an egg in his pocket and a lie in his heart. Luke returned to London 3 days later. He arrived by train. He had no money for a flight, had lost his wallet in the cave, had walked for 2 days down the mountain and through the Asturian countryside until he reached a town where he could call the emergency number that Garrick's syndicate had provided, and the syndicate had extracted him with the quiet, efficient, deniable professionalism that was their stock in trade, and they had not asked about the others, and Luke had not told them, and the transaction was complete. They had paid for his extraction, and he had given them nothing, and the debt was open. But the debt was abstract, and the stone was real, and the stone was in his pocket, pulsing, warm, alive. He went directly to the hospital. Great Ormond Street, the ward, the room, the bed. Sophie was there. She was smaller than when he had left her. The disease had continued its work. The steady, patient, inexorable consumption of her body, the hemolytic desquamation peeling her blood cells apart layer by layer, the way that the Cuelebre peeled the mineral from the bone, and she was pale and thin, and her eyes were too large for her face, and her hair was brittle, and her fingers were like sticks, and the monitors beside her bed beeped with the slow, irregular rhythm of a heart that was running out of reasons to beat. Luke sat beside her bed. He took her hand. Her fingers were cold, too cold, the kind of cold that is not temperature but absence, the absence of the spark, the icky, the vital force that the Cuelebre had been farming in the mountains of Asturias for centuries, and that Sophie's disease was farming in her body now. Cell by cell, day by day, the same process, the same mechanism, the same biology. He held her hand, and with his other hand he reached into his pocket and took out the stone. It pulsed. The amber glow was steady now, 1 beat per second, the calm, resting heartbeat of a dormant organism, and the warmth of it was against his palm, and the warmth was not just heat, it was health. It was the template of a body that had been alive for centuries, that had never been sick, that had never known decay, and the template was ready, waiting, a pattern encoded in the saliva's crystalline structure, a pattern that could be transferred to any living thing that needed it. All it needed was a catalyst, fresh blood, a few milliliters, a few drops. The blood would activate the stone's regenerative mechanism, and the stone would absorb Sophie's disease, the hemolytic desquamation, the cellular decay, the self-destructive process that was eating her from the inside, and it would transfer health in its place, and the health would come from the blood, from the few drops of fresh blood that Luke would provide, and the transaction would be complete. The cost was blood. The cost was vitality. The cost was the understanding that the stone did not create health from nothing. It transferred it from one body to another, and the body that gave the health lost it, and the body that received it gained it, and the loss was the price. But there was another cost, a cost that Luke had discovered on the train, in the bathroom, in the harsh fluorescent light of the cramped, rattling compartment. He had taken off his jacket to wash his face, and he had seen it on his left forearm just below the elbow, a patch of skin that was different. The skin was gray, not discolored, not bruised, not the gray of illness or fatigue, but the gray of stone, of scale. The patch was small, perhaps 3 centimeters in diameter, and it was hard. Not calloused, not the thickened skin of a manual worker, but hard, impenetrable, the hardness of keratin, of chitin, of the material that formed the Cuelebre's scales. And when Luke pressed his fingernail against it, his nail slid off. It could not scratch the surface. The surface was harder than bone, harder than enamel, harder than anything that human skin was supposed to be. The stone was not just a medicine. It was not just an egg. It was a seed. And it had been in Luke's pocket, against his body, his skin, his warmth, for 3 days, and in those 3 days it had been doing what seeds do. It had been planting. The stone's contact with his skin, the warmth and the pulse and the biological transfer that the stone was designed to perform, had not just been warming his hand. It had been depositing, planting, seeding his tissue with the template of the Cuelebre's body, and the template was taking root, and the gray patch on his arm was the first shoot. Luke had looked at the patch in the bathroom mirror, and he had understood everything. The Cuelebre did not just guard its seeds, it distributed them. It planted them in the bodies of the creatures that came to steal them, the treasure hunters, the mercenaries, the desperate men who crawled into its mountain and took its stones and carried them into the world. The creature let them go. It let them escape. It had always let them escape, because the escape was the point, because the escaping men carried the seeds, and the seeds grew, and the men became the new guardians, the new Cuelebres, the new iteration of a cycle that had been running since before the mountains existed. The stone in his hand was not a cure for his daughter. It was a trap, a beautiful, glowing, warm, pulsing trap that offered the one thing that no parent could refuse, the life of their child, and that demanded in return the one thing that no parent could calculate, the cost, the real cost, not the blood, not the vitality, the transformation. The slow, irreversible, biological transformation of the person who used it into something that was not human, something that was the creature, something that would grow and age and molt and die, and plant its own seeds in the bodies of the next generation of desperate, loving, doomed men who would come to the mountain looking for a cure and would find instead a curse. Luke sat beside Sophie's bed and held the stone and looked at his daughter and looked at the gray patch on his arm and understood that he was going to do it anyway. He did it at midnight when the ward was quiet and the nurses were at their station and the monitors were becoming their slow, irregular beep, and the light from the hallway fell through the door in a thin, yellow rectangle that lay across the floor like a path. He pricked his finger. A lancet, a diabetic supplies kit that he had stolen from the supply closet. A single drop of blood, dark and thick and warm on the surface of the stone. The blood spread. It did not run, it adhered, coating the amber surface in a thin, red film, and the stone absorbed it. Instantly. The blood was drawn into the crystalline structure the way water is drawn into a sponge, and the stone's pulse quickened, and the amber glow brightened, and the warmth intensified, and the stone was awake. He pressed it against Sophie's chest, against the sternum, directly over the heart, the way he had seen the man in Bilbao do it, Garrick's story, the man with liver cancer, the 30-second cure. He pressed the stone against the thin, cold skin of his daughter's chest, and he felt the pulse, 2 pulses, Sophie's heart and the stone's pulse, and for a moment they were out of sync, 2 rhythms running in parallel, and then they synchronized. The stone's pulse matched Sophie's heartbeat, and the 2 rhythms became one, and the stone began to do its work. Luke felt it. Through his hand, through his fingers, through the contact between his skin and the stone and Sophie's skin, he felt the transfer. It was not metaphorical. It was physical. It was a flow, a current, a movement of something from one place to another, the way electricity moves through a wire, the way blood moves through a vein. The something was moving from his hand into the stone and from the stone into Sophie's chest, and the something was health, was vitality, was the icky, the spark, and Luke could feel it leaving him, leaving his fingers, his hand, his arm, his body, and entering the stone, and the stone was converting it, transforming it, purifying it, and the purified spark was entering Sophie, and Sophie was. She was breathing. Her chest was rising, and the rise was deeper, fuller. the lungs expanding with a capacity that they had not had in months, and the monitors were changing. The beep was faster, steadier, the rhythm of a heart that was finding its pace, that was remembering what it was like to beat without fighting, without struggling, without the constant, crushing weight of a disease that was eating it from the inside. The gray tone was leaving her skin. The color was returning, pink, warm, the flush of blood in tissue that is healing, that is regenerating, that is being rebuilt by a force that does not understand disease or decay because it has never experienced them. Luke watched his daughter heal. He watched the color return to her face, the fullness return to her cheeks, the brightness return to her eyes which opened, slowly blinking, and she looked up at him. And she smiled, and the smile was the smile of a child who has been very sick for a very long time and who has suddenly, impossibly, inexplicably, felt the sickness lift, felt the weight leave, felt the body become light and warm and whole, and the smile was the most beautiful and the most terrible thing that Luke had ever seen, because the smile was the proof that the stone was working, and the proof that the stone was working was the proof that the cost was being paid, and the cost was being paid by him, and the payment was the gray patch on his arm, which was growing. He could feel it. While Sophie smiled and the monitors beeped and the stone pulsed against her chest, the gray patch on his arm was expanding. Slowly, steadily, the color spreading from the original 3-centimeter circle outward, in a circular pattern that was the same pattern as the Lichtenberg figures in a different building in a different country on a different night. The branching, fractal, vein-like pattern of an electrical discharge, of a biological discharge, of a template being written into tissue that was not designed to receive it. The patch was now 6 centimeters, 8, 10. The gray skin was spreading down his forearm toward his wrist, toward his hand, and the hand that held the stone was changing. The skin was tightening, the texture was roughening, the surface was hardening, and Luke could see the first faint outline of scales. Not the massive dinner plate-sized scales of the Cuelebre in its old age phase, the scales of a new Cuelebre, a young Cuelebre, a Cuelebre in its first, active, aggressive, predatory phase. He pulled the stone away. Sophie gasped, the gasp of a body that has been given a gift and is reluctant to let it go, but the transfer was done. The disease was gone. The monitors were normal. Sophie's heart was beating with the strong, steady, confident rhythm of a healthy child, and her skin was pink and warm and alive, and her eyes were clear and bright and whole, and she sat up in the bed and said, "Daddy, I feel better." And the words were the most beautiful words in any language, and they were also the most expensive because the price was written on Luke's arm in gray. He put the stone back in his pocket. The stone was inert now. The blood had been consumed, the transfer was complete, and the amber glow had faded to a faint, barely perceptible pulse, the resting heartbeat of a seed that had been planted and was now dormant, waiting for the next catalyst. The next drop of blood, the next desperate, loving, doomed parent who would hold it against their child's skin and feel the spark leave their body and enter the stone and enter the child, and the child would live, and the parent would change, and the cycle would continue. Luke buttoned his sleeve. The gray patch was hidden. The scales were hidden. The transformation was in its earliest stage, invisible, deniable, something that he could explain away as a skin condition, as a reaction, as a side effect of the stress and the travel and the 3 days in the mountains and the 3 days on the train and the lifetime of guilt and grief and the terrible, beautiful, crushing weight of knowing that he had saved his daughter's life by beginning the process of losing his own. He sat beside Sophie's bed. He held her hand. She was sleeping now, a real sleep, a healthy sleep, the deep, peaceful, restorative sleep of a body that has been healed, and her breathing was even and her pulse was strong and her skin was warm and she was alive, and Luke held her hand and looked at the wall and listened to the monitors and waited for the morning. The morning came, the doctors came. They examined Sophie and their faces showed what Luke already knew: the disease was gone, not in remission, gone. The blood work was normal. The cell count was normal. The hemolytic desquamation was not present, the tissue was healthy, the organs were functioning, Sophie was cured. They did not know how. They asked Luke and Luke said, "I don't know." And the lie was so smooth and so practiced and so convincing that he almost believed it himself. They asked about experimental treatments, about the clinical trials he had been researching, about the alternative therapies, and Luke said, "I don't know, I don't know, I don't know." And the doctors nodded and wrote their notes and ordered more tests and left. And Sophie was alive, and Luke was changing, and the hospital was warm and the morning was bright, and the world was the same as it had always been, except that Luke Varma was no longer entirely human. He went home. Not to the hospital, to his flat, the small, dark, empty flat in Islington that he had barely inhabited in the months since Sophie's diagnosis. The flat where the mail was piled on the floor and the dishes were in the sink, and the bed was unmade, and the laptop was open on the table with the email from the GMC still on the screen. The formal notification of the revocation of his medical license, and the words were the same as they had always been, and the flat was the same, and the world was the same, and Luke sat on the unmade bed and took off his jacket and rolled up his sleeve and looked at his arm. The gray patch covered his forearm from elbow to wrist. The scales were visible now, not faint outlines but raised, distinct, interlocking plates of keratin and mineral, the same material as the Cuelebre scales, and the scales were warm, body temperature, the temperature of a living thing, and when Luke pressed his finger against them he could feel the pulse beneath them. His pulse, his heartbeat, but the heartbeat was changing. It was slowing. Not the way a dying heart slows, the way a large heart slows, the way the heart of a creature that is growing, that is becoming massive, that is becoming the mountain, slows, and the heartbeat was now approximately 1 beat every 2 seconds, and the rate was decreasing, and Luke could feel it in his chest. The long, slow, deep-time pulse of something that was not aging but growing, not dying but transforming. He sat on his bed in his flat in Islington and looked at his arm and listened to his heartbeat slow, and felt the warmth spread through his body. Not the warmth of fever but the warmth of metamorphosis. The warmth of a caterpillar becoming a butterfly, except that the butterfly was a dragon, and the dragon was ancient, and the ancient was patient, and the patient was eternal. He went to the bathroom. He looked in the mirror. His face was the same, dark skin, dark eyes, the face of a man of Indian descent who had grown up in London and studied medicine at Cambridge and built a career and lost everything and then found, in a cave in the mountains of Asturias, the one thing that he could not refuse. His face was the same, but his eyes were not the same. The color was changing. The dark brown was lightening, fading, and in the center of each iris, a faint ring of amber was appearing, the same amber as the stone, the same amber as the Cuelebre's saliva, the same amber as the glow that had lit the cave and the stones and the gold and the bones, and the amber was spreading, and the eyes were becoming the eyes of the creature. He looked at his eyes in the mirror, and the eyes looked back at him, and in the eyes he saw the mountain. He saw the cave. He saw the gold. He saw the bones. He saw the creature, the massive, ancient, slate-end obsidian body sleeping on its hoard, breathing its slow, geological breath, and the creature was him. Not in the future. Now. The transformation had begun, and the beginning was the end, and the end was the beginning, and the cycle was turning, and Luke Varma was becoming the thing he had stolen from, and the thing he had stolen from had let him steal, because the stealing was the planting, and the planting was the point. He turned from the mirror. He went to the window. He opened it. The London air came in, cold, damp, the air of a city in November, the air of exhaust and rain, and the particular urban mineral smell of a metropolis that is built on layers of older cities. And the air was wrong. Not wrong in the way that polluted air is wrong. Wrong in the way that air is wrong when it is not the air you need. Because the air Luke needed was not London air. It was cave air. It was the warm, wet, briny, mineral body heat air of a cave in the mountains of Asturias, and the need was not psychological. It was biological. His body was changing, and the changing body required a different environment, a warmer, wetter, darker, deeper environment. And the flat in Islington was not that environment, and the discomfort was growing. A deep, cellular, tissue-level discomfort that was not pain but wrongness, the wrongness of a seed planted in the wrong soil. And beneath the discomfort, something else. A sound. Not a sound that he heard with his ears. A sound that he heard with his blood, with his bones, with the amber in his eyes and the scales on his arm and the slowing, deepening, expanding beat of his changing heart. A distant, saltwater wind, blowing from a direction that was not north or south or east or west, but inward, downward, deeper, the direction of the inside of the earth, the direction of Mar Cuejada. Mar Cuejada. The words surfaced in his mind the way a memory surfaces, not his memory, the creature's memory, the memory of a place that was warm and salt and deep, a place where the water was thick and the stone was soft and the caves were vast and the gold was plentiful and the prey was, no, not prey, the children. The children that the Cuelebre bred, the new guardians that it planted in the bodies of the men who came to steal its stones, the men who carried the seeds into the world and who grew and changed, and eventually, inevitably, returned to the mountain or found a new mountain or became a mountain. And the mountain was the body, and the body was the mountain, and the cycle was eternal. The wind blew, the saltwater wind, the wind from Mar Cuejada, the paradise that the Cuelebre sought, the place where it bred new guardians. And Luke understood, standing at the window of his flat in Islington, with his daughter alive in a hospital and his arm covered in scales and his heart beating once every 3 seconds and the amber spreading through his eyes, that Mar Cuejada was not a place. It was a destination. It was the destination of every Cuelebre seed, the pull, the gravity, the biological imperative that drew the transformed back to the deep, to the warm, to the dark, to the place where the new guardians would grow and age and molt and die, and plant their own seeds in the bodies of the next generation of desperate, loving, doomed parents. The wind blew, the scales grew, the heartbeat slowed. And Luke Varma, physician, father, thief, seed, stood at the window of his flat in Islington and listened to the distant, saltwater wind blowing from the direction of Mar Cuejada, and he understood that he had not saved his daughter's life. He had traded it. He had traded his humanity for her survival, and the trade was not a trade but a transformation, and the transformation was not an ending but a beginning, and the beginning was the same as the ending, and the cycle was the same as it had always been, and the creature in the mountain had not let him go. It had planted him. It had planted him the way a farmer plants a field, and the field was the world, and the world was full of parents with dying children, and the world was full of caves, and the caves were full of gold, and the gold was full of stones, and the stones were full of seeds, and the seeds were full of the wind. The saltwater wind, blowing from Mar Cuejada, blowing from the deep, calling him home. 6 months later, a hiker in the Picos de Europa reported a sound. Not a sound she heard with her ears, a sound she heard with her bones, a low, deep, subsonic pulse that came from the mountain and that traveled through the rock and the soil and the air, and that settled in her chest and vibrated, and the vibration was not unpleasant. It was warm, it was comforting. It was the sound of a heartbeat that was slow and deep and ancient, and that was, the hiker told the local newspaper, the most peaceful thing I have ever felt. The newspaper did not print the story. The hiker went back to the mountain the following weekend. She took a tent and a sleeping bag and a thermos of coffee, and she set up camp at the base of the cliff where La Boca had been, the cliff that was now a smooth, featureless wall of sealed stone, with no cave, no mouth, no entrance, just rock, and she sat against the wall and listened, and the heartbeat came through the stone and into her body, and the heartbeat was warm, and the warmth was peaceful, and the peace was the trap. She did not come back from the mountain. In a hospital in London, a girl named Sophie Varma was healthy. She was strong. She was vibrant. She was 10 years old and she had survived a disease that had no cure, and the doctors called it a miracle, and her mother called it a blessing, and Sophie called it the time Daddy fixed me. Her father had not visited in 3 months. His flat in Islington was empty. His phone was disconnected. His email was inactive. The GMC had no record of him. The hospital had no forwarding address. Luke Varma had vanished from the world the way that the villagers of the Asturian mountains had vanished. Not violently, not dramatically, but quietly, completely, leaving behind only a set of folded clothes on an unmade bed and a faint, amber stain on the bathroom mirror that the cleaning service could not remove. And somewhere in a cave, in a mountain, in the deep, warm, dark, wet interior of the earth, a new Cuelebre was growing. It was small, young in its first active phase, and its scales were the color of dark skin and dark stone, and its eyes were the amber of a physician's love and a creature's hunger, and its heartbeat was the heartbeat of a man who had given everything to save his daughter and who had received in return the one thing that no parent could refuse: the knowledge that she would live. And the price? The price was the wind. The saltwater wind, blowing from Mar Cuajada, blowing from the deep, blowing from the place where the Cuelebre bred its guardians and where the guardians grew, and where the growing was not life but transformation, and the transformation was not death but continuation, and the continuation was the cycle, and the cycle was eternal, and the eternal was the mountain, and the mountain was the body, and the body was the Cuelebre, and the Cuelebre was Luke, and Luke was the mountain, and the mountain was the wind. The wind blew. The scales grew. The heartbeat slowed. And the world, full of caves, full of gold, full of stones, full of seeds, full of parents with dying children, turned on its axis in the dark of space. And the dark was warm, and the warm was the trap, and the trap was the cure, and the cure was the cost, and the cost was everything, and everything was the price of a child's life, and the price was paid, and the paying never stopped. Author's note on the Cuelebre. The Cuelebre, or Cuelebre, is a creature from Asturian and Cantabrian mythology, described as a winged dragon or serpent that guards hoards of treasure in caves. In the traditional folklore, the Cuelebre is immortal but ages over centuries, becoming massive and sluggish. It is said to demand tribute from villagers in the form of milk and livestock, and its saliva, which solidifies into a glowing substance called piedra de vida, stone of life, is said to have healing properties. The creature is also associated with the myth of Mar Cuajada, curdled sea, a paradise-like body of water that the Cuelebre seeks as it approaches the end of its life. The life cycle described in this story, born small and active, growing massive and dormant in old age, then molting violently, is drawn from the traditional lore. The concept of the Cuelebre's saliva, stones as a regenerative agent that requires a blood sacrifice, is an original elaboration on the folklore, but it is consistent with the mythological framework in which the creature is a guardian of life-sustaining substances. The idea that the creature plants its stones in the bodies of those who steal them, transforming them into new Cuelebres, is also an original elaboration, but it draws on the mythological theme of the Cuelebre as an eternal, cyclically reproducing entity. The descriptions of the Asturian landscape, the Picos de Europa, and the village of Cangas de Onís are based on real geography. The disease described in the story, generalized hemolytic desquamation, is fictional. Thank you for listening to today's stories. If you enjoyed, please leave a like and subscribe, so you don't miss the stories yet to come.